The dead of winter, Montana Territory, 1876. A woman stands alone at a fresh grave, snow falling silently around her as hostile eyes watch from the distance. She has no idea that by sunrise she'll be running for her life, or that her salvation will come from the most unexpected place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Miller's fingers trembled as she clutched the worn leather Bible to her chest, the bitter Montana wind cutting through her mourning clothes like they were nothing but gossamer. 6 weeks had passed since they'd laid Thomas in the frozen ground, but the pain remained as fresh as the day he'd been thrown from his horse, his neck broken before he ever hit the ground. The small wooden cross marking his grave stood stark against the white landscape surrounding the Miller homestead. "Time to go inside, Mrs. Miller," Margaret Jenkins said softly, placing a weathered hand on Ellie's shoulder. "You'll catch your death out here." Ellie nodded absently, her eyes still fixed on Thomas's grave. Death would be a mercy compared to the hollow existence stretching before her. At 26, she was already a widow in a harsh territory that devoured the weak and unprepared. "Thank you for bringing the supplies, Margaret," Ellie murmured, finally turning toward the small cabin Thomas had built with his own hands when they'd claimed this land 3 years ago. The cabin represented everything they'd dreamed of when leaving Pennsylvania: independence, possibility, a future they would build together. "Victor Holloway was asking about you in town yesterday," Margaret said cautiously as they walked. "Said he was concerned about you out here all alone." Ellie's spine stiffened. "I'm sure he was." Since Thomas's death, his uncle Victor had shown an unnerving interest in her welfare and in the 160 acres of prime timber and grazing land that Thomas had secured through the Homestead Act. The deed was in both their names, a rarity Thomas had insisted upon that now served as Ellie's only protection. "He mentioned he might ride out to check on you." Margaret's voice held a warning. "I'm managing just fine," Ellie replied, more sharply than intended. Margaret had been her only real friend since arriving in Pine Creek, and the older woman's concern was genuine. Inside the cabin, Ellie stoked the dying embers in the fireplace, bringing the flames back to life. Margaret busied herself unpacking the supplies: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition for the rifle Thomas had taught Ellie to shoot when they first arrived. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a main room for cooking and living, and a small bedroom, partitioned off by a handmade quilt. "He's bringing paperwork next time," Margaret said quietly. "Says Thomas promised him the land if anything happened." Ellie's hands froze mid-task. "That's a lie. Thomas never would have—" "I know that, and you know that," Margaret interrupted, "but Victor Holloway owns half the county, and Judge Peterson drinks at his table every Sunday." Fear and anger twisted together in Ellie's stomach. The Holloways had never approved of Thomas marrying a schoolteacher from back east with no family connections or fortune. Victor had offered to buy their claim twice before, and Thomas had refused both times, recognizing the true value of the land with its year-round spring and rich soil. "The deed is legal and filed properly in Helena," Ellie said, trying to convince herself as much as Margaret. "Thomas made sure of it. Legal only matters when the law is on your side." Margaret's lined face was grim. "And I'm not sure Sheriff Porter has the backbone to stand against Victor Holloway." After Margaret left, Ellie sat by the fire. Thomas's wedding gift to her, a small silver locket clutched in her palm. Inside was a miniature portrait of him, his eyes kind and determined. "I won't lose our dream," she whispered to the flickering image. 3 days later, hoofbeats approaching the cabin roused Ellie from sleep just after dawn. She dressed hurriedly, heart pounding, and reached for Thomas's rifle before peering through the frost-edged window. Victor Holloway sat astride his black stallion, his wife Gertrude perched primly on a chestnut mare beside him. Behind them rode two ranch hands, their expressions blank, but their presence unmistakably threatening. Ellie opened the door before they could knock, the rifle held casually at her side. "Mr. Holloway, Mrs. Holloway, this is unexpected." Victor removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked dark hair. At 52, he maintained the powerful build that had helped him claim his own substantial holdings 20 years earlier. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying a forced warmth that never reached his eyes, "we've come to discuss your situation." "My situation is not up for discussion," Ellie replied evenly, making no move to invite them inside. Gertrude Holloway's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "Really, Eleanor, we're family. Thomas would want us to look after you." "Thomas wanted me to have this land," Ellie countered, "as his wife and legal co-owner." Victor's fake smile faltered. "A woman alone can't manage a homestead. It's dangerous and impractical. We've come with a generous offer." "I'm not selling," Ellie interrupted. $300. Victor continued as if she hadn't spoken. "More than fair for undeveloped land. You could return east, perhaps resume teaching." The insult of the offer, less than a quarter of the land's true worth, was clearly intentional. This wasn't negotiation, it was intimidation. "The deed is in my name," Ellie said firmly. "I'm staying." Victor's expression hardened. "Thomas promised this land would return to the family if anything happened to him. We have witnesses." "Then you should have no trouble proving that in court," Ellie challenged, knowing full well that any witnesses would be men in Victor's employ. "Courts take time," Victor said, his voice dropping to a menacing rumble. "And winter's long in these parts. Accidents happen to people alone in the wilderness." Ellie raised the rifle slightly, not aiming but ensuring it was visible. "I'm aware of the dangers, Mr. Holloway. Now please leave my property." Victor replaced his hat slowly, eyes narrowing. "This isn't over, Eleanor. A week from now you'll be begging to take my offer." He turned his horse, gesturing for the others to follow. "Think carefully about your position." As they rode away, Ellie's confident facade crumbled. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the rifle. Victor's threat hung in the air like a physical presence. She wasn't naive. She'd lived in Montana territory long enough to know that laws meant little without power to enforce them. And Victor Holloway had power in abundance. That night, Ellie barred the door and windows, keeping the rifle close as she tried to sleep. Her dreams were fractured with images of Thomas falling, of land deeds burning, of Victor Holloway standing over her with triumph in his cold eyes. Mourning brought no relief. As she collected firewood near the tree line, she spotted two riders watching from the distant ridge, Victor's men, making no attempt to conceal their surveillance. The message was clear. She was being watched, her isolation weaponized against her. For 3 days, the watchers remained. On the fourth morning, Ellie awoke to find her small chicken coop broken into, the hens slaughtered, their blood painting macabre patterns in the snow. A warning, unmistakable in its cruelty. That afternoon, Margaret arrived with news that chilled Ellie's blood further. "Victor's telling everyone in town that Thomas was in debt to him. Says he has a signed note giving the land as collateral." "It's a lie," Ellie insisted. "Thomas kept meticulous records. There was no debt." "Sheriff Porter's asking to see any papers you might have," Margaret continued. "Says he wants to help sort it out before things get messy." Ellie felt the noose tightening. If Victor had fabricated documents, her word alone might not be enough, especially against a man whose influence extended to the highest offices in the territory. "I need to get to Helena," Ellie realized suddenly. "The Territorial Land Office. We'll have the original deed filing. If I can get a certified copy." "Victor's men are watching the trails," Margaret warned, "and it's 50 miles to Helena." Ellie's determination hardened. "Then I'll need to be clever about it." That night, Ellie packed what she could carry, Thomas's journals documenting their claim improvements, the small strongbox containing their marriage certificate and what little money they had saved, ammunition, dried food, and warm clothing. If she could reach Helena and return with proof of her ownership, perhaps Sheriff Porter would have no choice but to support her claim. She was placing the locket around her neck when the first shot shattered her window. Ellie dropped to the floor as glass rained around her, heart hammering against her ribs. More shots followed, splintering wood and destroying the quiet night. "Come out, Mrs. Miller," a rough voice called. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Boss says, "This is your last chance to be reasonable." Ellie crawled to where she'd left the rifle, struggling to control her trembling hands. She recognized the tactics. They weren't trying to hit her, only to terrorize her into submission. Counting 4 distinct voices, she knew she was outnumbered. If she fled out the back toward the woods, they'd see her in the moonlight. A crash from the front door told her they were done waiting. She fired a warning shot through the broken window, buying seconds as they ducked for cover. Grabbing her pack, Ellie moved to the small root cellar door hidden beneath the rag rug in the corner. Thomas had dug the cellar himself, insisting they needed storage for winter vegetables. "Always have a way out," he told her with a wink. At the time, she'd thought he was being excessive. Now, she silently thanked him for his foresight. The cellar connected to a narrow tunnel that emerged 50 yards away, concealed by a fallen log. Thomas had built it after hearing stories of Indian raids in the early days of settlement. As she crawled through the damp earth passage, Ellie heard the men breaking down her door, their shouts turning to confusion as they discovered the cabin empty. Emerging into the frigid night, Ellie oriented herself by the stars, as Thomas had taught her. Helena lay southwest, but going directly there would be suicide with Victor's men searching. Instead, she headed north toward Blackwater Canyon, a maze of rocky ravines where she might lose any pursuers. The night was bitterly cold, the moon casting blue-white light across the snow-covered landscape. Every sound made her flinch. The crack of a branch, the distant howl of wolves. She'd been raised in Philadelphia, where wilderness was something read about in books. Though Thomas had taught her basic survival skills, she'd never imagined having to use them alone. Dawn found her exhausted and chilled to the bone, her fingers numb despite her gloves. The canyon lay before her, its dark mouth promising shelter but also unknown dangers. Behind her, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of pursuit. Dogs, barking, men calling. Victor had sent tracking hounds. Panic gave her a fresh surge of energy. Ellie plunged into the canyon, scrambling over rocks and through narrow passages, searching for a way to throw off the dogs. She remembered Thomas, mentioning that water could break a scent trail. When she came upon a shallow stream running through the canyon floor, she waded in, gasping at the icy shock, and followed it downstream. The dog's barking grew louder despite her efforts. Ellie's strength was failing, her wet clothes beginning to freeze to her skin. As she rounded a bend in the canyon, her foot slipped on a moss-covered rock. She fell hard, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sickening pop. Pain shot up her leg, so intense that black spots danced before her eyes. "No," she whispered through clenched teeth, "not like this." Dragging herself to the canyon wall, Ellie pulled her body into a small recess between 2 boulders, making herself as small as possible. She could hear the dogs clearly now, their excited yelps echoing off the stone walls. Soon their handlers would appear and her desperate flight would end. A shadow fell across her hiding place. Ellie looked up, expecting to see one of Victor's men. Instead, she found herself staring into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a face weathered by exposure and framed by dark hair streaked with gray. The stranger was dressed in buckskins and furs, a rifle slung across his back, and a knife at his belt. Please, she whispered, not knowing if this mountain man was salvation or merely a different kind of danger. He assessed her silently, taking in her injured state and the fear in her eyes. Then, without a word, he reached down and lifted her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing. Before Ellie could protest, he was moving swiftly through the canyon, taking paths invisible to her untrained eye. The last thing she remembered before exhaustion claimed her was being carried through the wilderness in a stranger's arms, the sound of dogs and men fading behind them like a nightmare at dawn. Consciousness returned to Ellie slowly, warmth seeping into her bones after what felt like an eternity of cold. She lay on a bed of furs beside a small stone fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows across rough-hewn log walls. For a moment, confusion reigned. This wasn't her cabin, wasn't anywhere she recognized. Memory flooded back with the throbbing, pain in her ankle, the attack, her flight, the canyon, the stranger with the piercing blue eyes. "You should rest," a deep voice said from the shadows. "Ankles bad but not broken." Ellie struggled to sit up, wincing as she moved her injured leg. The mountain man sat across the small cabin, whittling a piece of wood with methodical precision. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-40s, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His beard was neatly trimmed rather than wild, suggesting a man who chose solitude rather than one who'd been consumed by it. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy from thirst. He gestured to a cup of water beside her makeshift bed. "My cabin. Blackwater Canyon, North Ridge. You're safe for now." Ellie drank gratefully, the water easing her parched throat. "Those men lost their trail about 3 miles back," he interrupted. "Used some old Shoshone tricks. Dogs can't. They follow where we went." Relief washed over her, though caution remained. This man had saved her, but she knew nothing about him or his intentions. "Thank you," she said carefully. "I'm Eleanor Miller." "Caleb Winters." He continued his whittling, seemingly uncomfortable with conversation. "How did you find me?" Caleb's hands paused momentarily. "Been watching Holloway's men watching you. Figured it was heading toward trouble." Ellie's eyes widened. "You've been watching my cabin?" "Watch everything in my territory," he corrected. "Holloway's been pushing boundaries for years, taking land that ain't his to take." There was something in his tone, a personal resentment that went beyond general principle. Ellie studied him more carefully, noting the fine quality of the rifle leaning against the wall, the books stacked neatly on a crude shelf. This was no simple mountain hermit. "You know Victor Holloway?" she ventured. Caleb set down his carving and fixed her with that penetrating blue gaze. "Known him longer than I care to. Known your husband too, though he wouldn't have remembered me." Surprise jolted through her. "You knew Thomas?" "Met him in Helena 2 years back, land office. He was registering improvements on your claim." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "Good man. Talked about his wife, the school teacher. How you could identify every tree and plant in a book, but were learning to tell them apart in the wild." Tears pricked Ellie's eyes at this unexpected connection to Thomas. "He always said I had more book learning than practical sense." "Book learning has its place," Caleb replied, nodding toward his small collection. "Thomas Miller had a good head, knew the value of that land beyond just timber and grazing." "The spring," Ellie said. "He always said water would be worth more than gold someday." Caleb nodded. "Water rights control this territory. Holloway knows it too. That's why he won't let you keep that land, deed or no deed." Ellie straightened, ignoring the pain in her ankle. "I was trying to reach Helena. The land office will have the original filing. If I can get a certified copy." "Won't matter," Caleb interrupted bluntly. "Holloway doesn't work through the law when the law doesn't suit him." The harsh truth of his words struck Ellie silent. She'd been naive to think official documentation would protect her from a man like Victor Holloway. "Then what can I do?" she finally asked, hating the defeat in her voice. Caleb rose, moving to check her ankle with surprisingly gentle hands. "First you heal, then we figure how to fight back." "We?" Ellie questioned. Something dark flickered in Caleb's eyes. "I have my reasons for wanting to see Holloway lose." Over the next 3 days, Ellie's strength returned slowly. The cabin, though small, was remarkably well appointed for a solitary mountain dweller. Caleb kept it meticulously clean, with medicinal herbs hanging from the rafters and carefully preserved food stores that spoke of years of self-sufficiency. He rarely spoke unless asked a direct question, disappearing for hours to hunt or check his traps. When present, he maintained a respectful distance, sleeping outside despite the cold to give her privacy in the cabin. On the 4th morning, Ellie hobbled outside using a crudely fashioned crutch, determined to prove her mobility. She found Caleb skinning a rabbit, his movements precise and practiced. "Why are you helping me?" she asked bluntly, tired of the mystery surrounding her taciturn rescuer. Caleb continued his work without looking up. "Told you, got my reasons." "That's not an answer," Ellie pressed. "You've risked your safety for a stranger. You're continuing to risk it by sheltering me. I deserve to know why." His hands stilled. For a long moment, Ellie thought he wouldn't respond. Then he set down his knife and reached inside his shirt, withdrawing a folded paper yellowed with age. 15 years ago, I had 300 acres of prime land east of Pine Creek. He began, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. Built a home for my wife, had a son on the way. He unfolded the paper. A land deed, she realized, similar to her own. Victor Holloway wanted that land. When I wouldn't sell, accidents started happening. Fences cut, livestock poisoned. Same pattern you've seen. A chill ran through Ellie that had nothing to do with the winter air. What happened? I went to Eleanor on business. 3 days. When I returned, his voice caught the only crack she'd heard in his stoic demeanor. Cabin was ash. My wife, Sarah. They said it was an accident. Chimney fire. Nothing suspicious. Horror filled Ellie. Victor Holloway. Never could. Prove it, Caleb cut her off. Sheriff back then was in his pocket, same as now. 2 weeks later, while I was still burying my wife and unborn child, Holloway's lawyer showed up with papers. Said I'd signed over the land to cover debts. Had witnesses swearing to it. But you hadn't, Ellie whispered. Never signed a thing, didn't matter. Judge ruled against me, same judge who dines with Holloway every Sunday. The parallels to her own situation were chilling. Victor was using the same tactics honed over years of unchecked greed. I'm sorry, she said, the words wholly inadequate for the tragedy he'd described. Caleb refolded the deed carefully, returning it to its place over his heart. Been watching Holloway since, then waiting when I saw what was happening with your land. He shook his head. Thomas Miller reminded me of myself before. Understanding dawned. You're not just helping me. You're finally fighting back. A look passed between them, recognition of a shared purpose that transcended their differences. In that moment, Ellie saw not just the mountain man who'd saved her life, but a person who'd lost everything and somehow kept going, carrying his grief and rage like the deed he kept close to his heart. Victor Holloway has stolen his last piece of land, Caleb said with quiet conviction. For the first time since Thomas's death, Ellie felt a spark of genuine hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally who understood her enemy better than anyone. Teach me, she said suddenly. Teach me what I need to know to survive out here, to fight back. Caleb studied her for a long moment, reassessing the city-bred schoolteacher before him. Finally, he nodded. We start tomorrow. The following weeks transformed Ellie in ways she never imagined possible. Despite her injured ankle, Caleb was a relentless teacher. He showed her how to move silently through the forest, how to track and hunt, how to disguise her trail from pursuers. With patient instruction, he improved her rudimentary shooting skills until she could hit targets Thomas would have thought impossible. More importantly, he taught her the canyon's secrets, hidden caves, underwater passages, trails invisible to untrained eyes. Knowledge that had kept him safe from Holloway for 15 years. "The land speaks," he told her repeatedly. "Most folks just never learn to listen." As winter deepened around them, Ellie's strength and confidence grew. The delicate hands that had once graded school children's papers now built snares and skinned game without hesitation. The woman who had once feared the wilderness embraced its harsh lessons, finding unexpected freedom in self-reliance. Caleb changed too, subtly but unmistakably. The more he taught, the more his taciturn nature softened. Occasional stories emerged during their evenings by the fire, memories of Sarah, glimpses of the man he'd been before tragedy reshaped him. One night, as they shared a meal of venison stew, Caleb asked about her life before Montana Territory. "I taught at a girls' school in Philadelphia," Ellie told him, surprised by how distant that life now seemed. "My parents died when I was young. Teaching was my only prospect." "How'd you meet Thomas?" A smile touched her lips at the memory. "He came east, seeking investors for a sawmill, spoke at a community meeting about opportunities in the West. He talked about Montana like it was heaven on earth, the mountains, the forests, the endless sky." "And you believed him?" "I believed in him," she corrected, "in his vision. We married 2 weeks later and headed west. My friends thought I'd lost my mind." "Had you?" Caleb asked, a rare hint of humor in his eyes. Ellie considered the question seriously. "No. Those 3 years with Thomas, building something from nothing, learning to rely on each other, they were difficult but wonderful. I never regretted following him west." "Even now," Caleb pressed, "with everything that's happened?" She stared into the fire, searching her heart. "Even now, Thomas gave me a freedom I never knew existed. If he hadn't brought me here, I'd never have discovered my own strength." Something in Caleb's expression shifted, respect mingling with something deeper, more personal. Sarah was like that, braver than she knew. The mention of his wife, offered voluntarily rather than extracted through questioning, marked a turning point. That night, the wall between them thinned further, revealing 2 people who'd lost everything yet refused to surrender to despair. As their 6th week in the cabin began, Caleb returned from checking his trapline with news that sent ice through Ellie's veins. "Holloway's men are searching the North Canyon," he reported grimly. "Getting closer every day. And there's more. He's filed formal papers claiming your land. Sheriffs posted notices in Pine Creek saying you abandoned the property." Anger flared in Ellie. "It's not abandoned. I was driven off at gunpoint." "Law doesn't care about what's true, only what can be proven." Caleb's expression was grim. "We need to know exactly what we're facing. I need to go into town." Fear gripped Ellie. "That's too dangerous. If you're recognized, I've avoided detection for 15 years, he reminded her. 3 days. I'll speak to Margaret Jenkins. She seems loyal to you." Ellie wanted to object further, but knew he was right. They needed information. And after weeks of learning from him, she was confident in her ability to defend herself in his absence. 3 days, she agreed reluctantly. "No longer." Caleb prepared to leave at dawn, packing lightly for speed. As he shouldered his rifle, Ellie impulsively reached for his hand. "Be careful," she said softly. He squeezed her fingers briefly, the most intimate contact they'd shared. "Keep the door barred. Use the hunting cabin if anything feels wrong." After he disappeared into the trees, the cabin felt eerily empty. Ellie busied herself with tasks, practicing the skills he'd taught her, trying to ignore the unfamiliar anxiety his absence created. On the second night, a storm descended upon the canyon, howling winds driving snow horizontally past the windows. Ellie stoked the fire higher, worry gnawing at her as she imagined Caleb caught in the blizzard. By midnight, the temperature had dropped so severely that ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the roaring fire. A sudden pounding at the door jolted her from uneasy sleep. Heart racing, she grabbed the rifle, approaching cautiously. "Ellie!" Caleb's voice barely audible above the storm. "Open up!" She hurried to remove the bar, gasping when he stumbled in, half frozen and supporting a second figure who appeared barely conscious. "Sheriff Porter?" she exclaimed, recognizing the lawman despite his frost-bitten face. "Help me get him to the fire," Caleb grunted, already dragging the sheriff toward the hearth. Together they removed Porter's frozen outer clothing and wrapped him in furs. As warmth gradually returned to his limbs, the sheriff's eyes flickered open, focusing slowly on Ellie's face. "Mrs. Miller," he croaked, "you're alive." "No thanks to Victor Holloway," she replied coldly, remembering the sheriff's previous inaction. Porter's weathered face crumpled with shame. "I know. That's why I came looking. Things have gone too far." Caleb handed the sheriff a cup of hot coffee laced with whiskey. "Tell her what you told me." Porter took a shaking sip before meeting Ellie's eyes. "Victor Holloway killed your husband." The world seemed to stop. "What?" "Thomas's fall wasn't an accident," Porter continued, his voice strengthening with confession. "Victor's foreman loosened his saddle before he rode out that day. Victor told me afterward, laughing about it, saying Thomas should have taken his offer when he had the chance." Grief and rage collided inside Ellie, nearly driving her to her knees. Thomas's death, preventable, deliberate, malicious. "And you did nothing," she whispered. Porter's gaze dropped. "I've been under Victor's thumb for years, too scared to cross him. But last week," he swallowed hard, "last week he ordered Gertrude to forge Thomas's signature on backdated loan documents. She's always been good at copying handwriting. When I objected, Victor reminded me how easy accidents happen." "So you finally found your courage," Caleb observed, his tone making clear how little he thought of the sheriff's belated conscience. "I knew they'd killed Thomas," Porter admitted. "Couldn't let them kill his widow too. I was trying to find you, warn you, got caught in the storm instead." Ellie's mind raced through implications. "If you testify against Victor, my word against his won't be enough," Porter interrupted. "But there's more. The land office in Helena was broken into last week. Records destroyed, including your deed filing." Cold understanding dawned. Victor was systematically erasing all evidence of her legal claim. "What about Gertrude?" Ellie asked suddenly. "Would she testify?" Porter shook his head. "She's as guilty as Victor, and too terrified of him to turn." "Then we have nothing," Ellie concluded bitterly. "Not nothing," Caleb interjected quietly. He pulled out a folded paper from inside his coat. "Margaret Jenkins gave me this. Said Thomas left it with her for safekeeping before he died." Ellie took the paper with trembling fingers. It was a letter in Thomas's handwriting addressed to her. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, my fears have come to pass. Victor has made veiled threats these past weeks that I can no longer ignore. He covets our land with a greed that knows no boundaries of family or decency. I've secured our deed with the territorial office, but made copies as well, one of which I've entrusted to Margaret. More importantly, I've discovered the true reason for Victor's interest. The survey I commissioned last month confirms what I suspected. Our property contains not just the spring we know of, but sits atop a substantial underground water table that feeds half the county. In the coming years, this will make our land worth 20 times what it is now. I pray this letter never reaches you, that my suspicions prove unfounded. But if the worst happens, know that I have left evidence of Victor's threats with my friend James Walsh at the bank in Helena. Trust no one in Pine Creek except Margaret. All my love, Thomas. Hope rekindled in Ellie's heart. James Walsh, do you know him, Sheriff? Porter nodded. Respected man. If Thomas left evidence with him, then we have a chance, Caleb finished. But first, we need to get to Helena alive. For the first time since Thomas's death, Ellie felt the pieces of a plan forming. Victor had stolen her husband, her home, and nearly her life. But he hadn't counted on the allies she would find. A sheriff reclaiming his honor, a mountain man seeking justice for his own lost family, and a widow who'd discovered she was far stronger than anyone had ever suspected. As the blizzard raged outside, the three unlikely conspirators bent their heads together, plotting a dangerous journey that would either restore justice to Pine Creek or cost them everything they had left. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, howling around the cabin like a living beast. Within the small shelter, Ellie studied Thomas's letter repeatedly, tracing his handwriting with her fingertips, searching for additional clues. Sheriff Porter's condition improved slowly, though frostbite had left 2 of his fingers blackened and painful. Helena's a 4-day journey in good weather, Caleb explained as they gathered around the crude map he'd drawn in the dirt floor. In this snow, longer, and Holloway's men will be watching every established trail. What about through Blackwater Canyon? Ellie suggested. You said yourself few know those paths. Caleb shook his head. Too dangerous in winter. Rock slides, ice falls. One wrong step and we'd never be found. Then we need another way, Sheriff Porter interjected, his voice stronger than it had been since his arrival. What about the old mining trails, the ones north of Thunder Valley? Caleb considered this. Abandoned years ago, treacherous, but Holloway's men wouldn't expect anyone to use them. And they connect to the northern route to Helena, Porter added. If we could reach them undetected. Hope flickered in Ellie's chest. When do we leave? We don't, Caleb corrected firmly. I go alone, less risk, faster travel. Ellie's objection was immediate. Absolutely not. This is my fight, my husband, my land, and my only chance at redemption, Porter added quietly. Caleb's frustration was evident in the tight set of his jaw. 2 injured travelers will slow me down, increase our chances of being caught. This isn't about heroics. It's about succeeding. Ellie stood, facing him directly. I haven't spent weeks learning to survive just to hide in safety while others risk everything for me. Either we go together or I follow you alone. The stubborn determination in her voice must have convinced him of her seriousness. After a long, tense silence, Caleb exhaled sharply. 3 days to prepare, he conceded grudgingly. Then we leave before dawn, no matter the weather. The preparations were methodical and thorough. Caleb insisted they each carry only essentials: food, ammunition, medical supplies. Every ounce of unnecessary weight could cost precious speed. He fashioned snowshoes for all 3 of them from flexible branches and strips of hide, critical for traversing the deep drifts they would encounter. Sheriff Porter proved surprisingly resourceful despite his injuries, offering insights about Holloway's usual patrol patterns and suggesting detours to avoid known lookout points. His knowledge, combined with Caleb's wilderness expertise, slowly formed a viable route to Helena. On their final evening, as Porter slept by the fire, Ellie found Caleb outside the cabin, staring at the stars now visible in the clearing sky. You don't have to do this, she said softly, coming to stand beside him. This vendetta with Holloway, it's mine and the sheriff's, not yours. Been my fight longer than yours, he reminded her without looking down. But you've built a life here, Ellie pressed, hidden but safe. If you help us reach Helena, Victor will know you're alive. He'll hunt you again. Now Caleb did turn, his eyes reflecting the cold starlight. "You still don't understand, do you? There's no life in hiding, just existence." He gestured toward the endless wilderness surrounding them. 15 years I've watched from these mountains. 15 years of waiting, while Holloway took more land, destroyed more lives. Something in his voice made Ellie reach for his hand. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. "Sarah wouldn't want me hiding forever," he continued more quietly. "She wanted children, a community, a future. Not a husband who disappeared into the mountains when she needed him most." Understanding dawned painfully. "You blame yourself for not being there when the fire happened." "I should have been there," he confirmed, the old guilt evident in every line of his face. "Should have protected her, or you would have died too," Ellie countered gently, "and Holloway would never face justice for either of you." Caleb looked down at their joined hands, a complex emotion crossing his weathered features. For a moment, Ellie thought he might pull away, retreat back behind the walls he'd maintained for 15 years. Instead, his fingers tightened around hers. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Dawn comes early." They departed as planned before first light, each carrying a pack and wearing the snowshoes Caleb had crafted. The temperature had risen slightly with the passing of the blizzard, but deep snow still blanketed the landscape, transforming familiar terrain into an alien wilderness of white. Caleb led, breaking trail through pristine drifts, his movements as efficient and purposeful as everything he did. Sheriff Porter followed, still weakened but determined, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Ellie brought up the rear, alert for signs of pursuit, her rifle accessible at her side. The first day passed in grueling silence, each step requiring concentration on the treacherous ground. By midday, Porter was struggling visibly, his damaged fingers and lingering weakness taxing his endurance. Yet he continued without complaint, refusing Ellie's concerned glances. They made camp that night in a narrow ravine, building only the smallest of fires, carefully shielded to prevent its light from being visible from a distance. As they huddled around the meager warmth, sharing jerked venison and hard biscuits, Ellie studied her unlikely companions, the outlaw sheriff seeking redemption, the solitary mountain man emerging from self-imposed exile. 3 wounded souls united by a common enemy. "Victor will have men on the Helena Road," Porter warned, as they planned the next day's journey. "He controls most of the freight wagons running supplies between settlements, eyes everywhere." "That's why we're not taking the road," Caleb replied, tracing a route on the crude map he'd drawn in the snow. "Old mining trails join up here, about 6 miles west of Thunder Valley. From there, abandoned logging paths eventually connect to the North Ridge Trail." Porter frowned. "That's a hard route, especially in winter." "Hard for Holloway's men too," Caleb pointed out. "That's the advantage." As they settled for the night, Ellie found sleep elusive despite her physical exhaustion. The stars overhead seemed impossibly bright, the silence of the wilderness absolute except for the occasional shifting of branches heavy with snow. She thought of her cabin, likely ransacked by now, perhaps destroyed like Caleb's had been. All evidence of her life with Thomas erased by Victor Holloway's methodical greed. Yet something unexpected had emerged from that loss, a strength she'd never known she possessed, a clarity of purpose that transcended mere survival. The woman who had arrived in Montana territory 3 years ago, full of Eastern sensibilities and book learning, would never have recognized the person she'd become. Dawn brought fresh challenges. The terrain grew steadily more difficult as they approached the abandoned mining region, the path narrowing between sheer rock faces still slick with ice. Twice they were forced to backtrack when fallen debris blocked their way, adding hours to their journey. By midday, Porter's strength was clearly failing. His face had taken on an alarming gray pallor, his steps becoming increasingly unsteady. When he stumbled for the third time, Caleb called a halt, helping the sheriff to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock. "I'm slowing you down," Porter acknowledged, his breathing labored. "You two should go ahead." "We stay together," Ellie said firmly, offering him water from her canteen. Caleb knelt to examine Porter's hands, carefully unwrapping the bandages around his frost-bitten fingers. His expression darkened at what he saw, the blackened tissue spreading, infection, setting in despite their careful treatment. "He needs a doctor," Caleb said quietly to Ellie, moving a few steps away from Porter. "Soon." "Helena's still 2 days away," Ellie whispered back, fear tightening her chest. Caleb hesitated, clearly weighing impossible options. "There's a mining settlement, Walker's Creek. Small, but they have a doctor of sorts. Half a day's journey north of here. Would Holloway have men there? Possible, but less likely than on the direct route to Helena." Caleb glanced back at Porter, who had closed, his eyes, his face drawn with pain. "It's a risk either way, but without treatment." The unspoken conclusion hung between them. Without medical attention, Porter might not survive to reach Helena at all. "Walker's Creek," Ellie decided. "We get him help, then continue to Helena. Ourselves, if necessary." Caleb nodded grimly. "We'll need a story. 3 strangers arriving together will draw attention." They crafted their cover carefully. Ellie would pose as Caleb's sister, traveling to visit family in Helena when their guide, Porter, fell ill. Simple, plausible, and unlikely to arouse suspicion in a remote settlement accustomed to travelers passing through. Porter rallied somewhat when told of the new plan, though his condition continued to deteriorate as they altered course toward Walker's Creek. By late afternoon, Caleb was practically carrying the sheriff, while Ellie scouted ahead, watching vigilantly for signs of danger. Walker's Creek appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, a collection of rough wooden buildings nestled in a narrow valley, smoke rising from stone chimneys into the darkening sky. Perhaps 20 structures in all, centered around what appeared to be a general store and saloon. A few figures moved between buildings, but the bitter cold had driven most indoors. "Remember," Caleb murmured as they approached, "we're just passing." He threw. "Nothing memorable about us." The settlement's sole lodging house was attached to the saloon, a common arrangement in mining towns where most residents were single men with little need for private accommodations. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman with sharp eyes and a perpetual frown, asked few questions beyond whether they could pay in advance. "My friend needs medical attention," Ellie explained, maintaining the story they'd agreed upon. "Is there a doctor here?" "Doc Evans," the woman replied, eyeing Porter's obvious distress. "I'll send my boy to fetch him. 2 bits extra for the service." Caleb handed over the required payment without comment, then helped Porter to the small room they'd been allocated. It was sparse but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a small fireplace already stoked with fresh wood. Doc Evans arrived within the hour. An elderly man with spectacles perched precariously on a bulbous nose, carrying a worn leather medical bag. He examined Porter's frostbitten fingers with professional detachment, clicking his tongue at the advancing infection. "Should have come sooner," he chided, opening his bag to retrieve instruments and medications. "Might save the hand, but these 2 fingers," he shook his head grimly, "need to come off before the infection spreads." Porter closed his eyes briefly, resignation etching new lines in his haggard face. "Do what you must, Doctor." Evans glanced at Ellie and Caleb. "You might want to wait downstairs. This won't be pleasant." "I'm staying," Ellie said firmly, moving to Porter's side. After all the sheriff had risked to help them, she wouldn't abandon him now, no matter how difficult the procedure. Caleb nodded his agreement. "We'll both stay." The amputation was as brutal as it was necessary, Porter's muffled cries despite. The whiskey Evans had provided as anesthetic piercing Ellie to her core. She held the sheriff's other hand throughout, offering what comfort she could, while Caleb assisted Evans with grim efficiency. When it was finally over, Porter lay unconscious, his maimed hand heavily bandaged, his face ashen but more peaceful than it had been in days. "He'll need rest," Evans advised as he packed his instruments. "Fever's likely. Keep him warm. Get broth into him if he wakes. I'll check back in the morning." After the doctor left, Ellie sank onto the second bed, the events of the day catching up with her in a wave of bone-deep exhaustion. Caleb moved to the window, peering cautiously through the threadbare curtain at the settlement beyond. "I'll go to the saloon," he decided. "Listen for news, see if there's talk of Holloway's men in the area. We should know what we're facing." Ellie nodded, too tired to argue that she should accompany him. In a mining settlement like Walker's, Greek, a woman alone in the saloon, would draw precisely the attention they were trying to avoid. "Be careful," she urged instead. "If there's any sign of danger, I'll be back within the hour," Caleb promised, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in reassurance. Alone with the unconscious sheriff, Ellie tended the fire and checked Porter's bandages, relieved to find no fresh bleeding. His breathing was steady, if shallow, and the fever Evans had warned of hadn't yet materialized. Small mercies, but she'd learned to be grateful for whatever fortune came their way. She must have dozed off despite her intention to remain alert, because the next thing she knew, Caleb was shaking her shoulder gently, his expression tense. "We have trouble," he said without preamble. "Holloway's men arrived an hour ago, 4 of them, asking questions at the saloon." Fully awake now, Ellie sat up. "Do they know we're here?" "Not yet. They're describing a woman matching your description, traveling with an older man. No mention of me, which means they don't know I'm involved." Caleb's tone was grim. "But they're offering a substantial reward for information. It won't take long for someone to make the connection." Ellie glanced at Porter, still unconscious on the other bed. "We can't move him. Not in his condition." Caleb was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing their limited options. "I'll lead them away," he finally said. "Create a false trail heading east. Once they're gone, you continue to Helena with Porter when he's strong enough." "No," Ellie protested immediately. "It's too dangerous. If they catch you—" "They won't," he interrupted with quiet confidence. "I've evaded better trackers than Holloway's hired guns. And if they do," Ellie pressed, "Victor will kill you without hesitation this time." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a softening that made him suddenly appear younger, less burdened by his years of solitude. "Some things are worth the risk, Ellie." The use of her familiar name, the first time he'd called her anything but Mrs. Miller, caught her by surprise, warming something deep within her despite the dire circumstances. "We came this far together," she reminded him. "We finish it together." Before he could argue further, a knock at the door silenced them both. Caleb motioned for Ellie to stand back, his hand moving to the knife at his belt as he approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called. "Doc Evans," came the muffled reply. "Brought medicine for your friend." Caleb exchanged a look with Ellie before opening the door, just enough to reveal the elderly physician clutching his medical bag and looking nervously over his shoulder. "You need to leave," Evans said without preamble, slipping into the room and closing the door firmly. Behind him, "There are men downstairs asking about a woman traveling with an injured companion, offering good money for information." "Has anyone told them about us?" Ellie asked anxiously. Evans shook his head. "Not yet. But Mabel at the front desk won't stay quiet long, not for the gold they're flashing. I came through the back stairs." "Our friend can't be moved," Caleb explained. "Not safely." The doctor hesitated, then made a decision. "My place is at the edge of town, small cabin but private. I can take him there tonight, once I've given him something for the pain. No one would think to look for him with me." Relief and gratitude flooded through Ellie. "Thank you, Doctor, but why would you help us? You don't even know us." Evans's face hardened unexpectedly. "I know Victor Holloway. Treated his wife Gertrude after he broke her arm last spring. Claimed she fell. Third fall I've treated her for." He looked between them knowingly. "Anyone Holloway's hunting this determinedly has a reason I'm inclined to respect." This unexpected ally bolstered Ellie's spirits. Perhaps they weren't as alone in standing against Victor as they'd believed. "How soon can we move him?" Caleb asked, already gathering their minimal belongings. "Give me 10 minutes to prepare him," Evans replied. "Then I'll come back with a stretcher. My assistant will help. Young fellow, but trustworthy." As the doctor administered laudanum to Porter, Ellie and Caleb finalized their plan in hushed tones. "I still think separating is our best option," Caleb insisted. "I can lead them away from Walker's Creek entirely." "And if you succeed, then what?" Ellie challenged. "You find us in Helena. By then it could be too late. Victor might have already manipulated events beyond repair." The truth of her words was evident in Caleb's frustrated expression. Time was against them. The longer they delayed reaching Helena and securing the evidence Thomas had left with James Walsh, the more opportunity Victor had to cover his tracks. "There's another way," Ellie said suddenly, an idea forming. "What if we use their expectations against them? They're looking for a woman with one injured man, not a couple traveling together, and certainly not you." Caleb caught her meaning immediately. "You want to hide in plain sight." "Exactly. We leave tonight together, but as husband and wife heading to Helena on family business. Different names, different story." Ellie's mind raced ahead. "Most of Holloway's men have never seen me up close. They're working from descriptions." "It could work," Caleb acknowledged grudgingly. "If we avoid direct contact, stay on main routes where a married couple wouldn't raise suspicion." "While they're searching the wilderness for a woman traveling alone with an injured companion," Ellie finished. "The sheriff will be safe with Dr. Evans until he recovers enough to follow." The plan took shape rapidly. Evans and his assistant arrived with the promised stretcher, moving Porter with practiced efficiency through back hallways and service doors to avoid detection. Ellie and Caleb would wait until full dark, then depart openly, portraying a married couple continuing their journey after a brief stop in Walker's Creek. As they prepared to leave, Ellie found herself surprisingly nervous about their deception. Playing the role of Caleb's wife required a natural familiarity she wasn't sure she could convincingly portray. They had grown closer during their weeks together, but always with careful boundaries maintained. "Ready?" Caleb asked, as the settlement finally quieted for the night. Ellie nodded, adjusting the shawl she'd borrowed from the doctor's limited collection of items left by previous patients. With her hair arranged differently and wearing clothing distinct from her usual attire, she hoped the disguise would be sufficient to avoid recognition. They stepped into the cold night, Caleb's arm protectively around her shoulders in a convincing display of marital concern. The saloon still blazed with light and noise, but the rest of Walker's Creek had settled into evening routines, few people braving the bitter cold without necessity. As they passed the saloon's windows, Ellie caught a glimpse of men she presumed were Holloway's hired guns, drinking and questioning the locals. Her heart stuttered momentarily, but Caleb's steady presence kept her moving forward, her face partially concealed by the shawl. They had nearly reached the edge of the settlement when a voice called out behind them, "You there! Hold up a moment!" Ellie froze, but Caleb's arm tightened around her, his voice low and urgent. "Keep walking, slower, but don't stop." Footsteps crunched in the snow behind them, approaching rapidly. Caleb finally turned, positioning himself slightly in front of Ellie. "Evening," he greeted calmly as one of Holloway's men, a tall, bearded fellow with a scar bisecting his left cheek, stopped a few paces away. "Where you folks headed this time of night?" the man asked, his tone somewhere between curious and suspicious. Eleanor, Caleb answered easily. My brother's expecting us day after tomorrow. Would have left earlier, but the wife wanted a proper meal and a real bed for once. He chuckled, the sound so natural that even Ellie almost believed him. The man's eyes narrowed, studying them both. You seen a woman traveling through? Pretty, dark-haired. Might have been with an older gent who was injured? Caleb shook his head. Can't say we have. Settlement's not that big, though. If they're here, someone at the saloon would know. That's where we've been asking, the man acknowledged, his gaze shifting to Ellie, still partially hidden by her shawl. Mind if I speak with your wife, mister? Women notice different things. A dangerous moment. Ellie could feel tension radiating from Caleb despite his outward calm, but refusing would only increase suspicion. Ellie lowered her shawl slightly, allowing her face to be visible while keeping her expression downcast, as a reserved frontier wife might. I haven't seen anyone like that, she said softly, adopting a slight accent, unlike her natural speaking voice. Just the miners and Dr. Evans, who treated my husband's cough. The mention of the doctor was deliberate misdirection, establishing a reason they might have been seen entering or leaving Evans's lodging house. Your husband, eh? The man glanced between them, clearly weighing their story. 5 years come spring, Caleb confirmed, his arms sliding around Ellie's waist with practiced ease. Now, if you'll excuse us, we'd like to make a few more miles before full dark. Something in his tone must have convinced the man, or perhaps he simply had no real reason to detain them further. With a curt nod, he stepped back. Safe travels, he offered, already turning his attention back toward the saloon. They maintained their unhurried pace until well beyond the settlement's edge, neither speaking until they were certain they weren't being followed. Only then did Caleb's arm drop from her waist, the absence of his warmth immediately noticeable in the frigid night. That was too close, Ellie breathed, her heart still racing from the encounter. But it worked, Caleb pointed out. He believed we were exactly what we claimed to be. The realization that they had successfully deceived one of Holloway's men filled Ellie with renewed confidence. Their plan might actually succeed if they could maintain the deception all the way to Helena. They traveled through the night, taking advantage of the clear sky and bright moon to make significant progress along the main road. By dawn, Walker's Creek was miles behind them, and they had encountered no further obstacles. They made camp in a small copse of trees just off the road, concealed enough for safety, but not so hidden as to appear suspicious to passing travelers. As Caleb built a small fire, Ellie reflected on how naturally they had fallen into the roles of husband and wife during their encounter with Holloway's man. The ease of it should have been disconcerting, yet somehow wasn't. You think Porter will be all right with Evans? She asked as they shared a meager breakfast of jerky and hard biscuits. Caleb nodded. The doctor seemed competent and motivated to help anyone working against Holloway. It's strange, Ellie mused. All this time, I thought Victor was untouchable. In these parts, yet we keep finding people who have their own reasons to see him fall. Men like Holloway create enemies wherever they go, Caleb observed. Most are just too afraid to act alone. The journey to Helena continued over the following day, their disguise as husband and wife proving effective when they encountered other travelers on the road. Each time, Caleb would engage in brief, friendly conversation while Ellie maintained a modest demeanor, gathering information without raising suspicion. By the second evening, Helena's distant lights were visible from the ridge they traversed, a constellation of civilization in the wilderness, promising both hope and danger. They would reach the territorial capital by mid-morning the following day, bringing them finally to the evidence Thomas had hidden and the justice they sought. That night, as they sheltered in an abandoned trapper's cabin Caleb had known of, Ellie found herself studying her companion with new eyes. The gruff mountain man who had rescued her seemed transformed by their journey and shared purpose. The walls he'd maintained for 15 years had gradually lowered, revealing glimpses of the man he'd been before tragedy rewrote his story. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "After Helena, if we succeed against Victor?" Caleb was silent for so long that Ellie thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held an uncertainty she'd never heard from him before. "Never thought that far ahead. 15 years focused on one thing doesn't leave much room for planning beyond." "You could reclaim your land," Ellie suggested. "Rebuild what was taken from you." He shook his head slowly. "That land holds nothing but ghosts for me now." "Then what?" Caleb's eyes met hers across the small fire separating them. "What about you, Ellie? What happens after you secure your claim?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on justice for Thomas and keeping her land that she hadn't truly considered the lonely reality that would follow. A woman alone on a remote homestead, surrounded by memories both beautiful and painful. "I don't know," she admitted. "The land was Thomas's dream first. I embraced it because I loved him. Now you need to decide if it's your dream too," Caleb finished for her, their eyes held in the firelight, unspoken possibilities suddenly filling the space between them. In that moment, Ellie realized how profoundly her feelings for Caleb had evolved from gratitude to respect, and finally to something deeper that she wasn't yet ready to name. Before either could break the charged silence, a sound outside the cabin froze them both. The unmistakable approach of multiple horses, moving with deliberate stealth. "Holloway's men," Caleb whispered, immediately dousing the fire. "They must have followed us from Walker's Creek after all." Ellie moved to the cabin's single window, peering carefully through a crack in the shutters. In the moonlight, she could make out at least 6 riders surrounding the small structure, their weapons drawn. "There's too many," she whispered back, "and nowhere to run." For the first time since she'd known him, Caleb Winters looked truly afraid, not for himself, but for her. In that moment of crisis, he made a decision that would alter everything. "Listen to me, Ellie," he said urgently, taking her face between his calloused hands. "There's no time to explain, but I need you to trust me. No matter what happens next, what I say or do, remember that everything since I found you in that canyon has been real. Everything." Before she could respond, he pressed something into her palm, the deed to his land that he always carried next, to his heart. Then, unexpectedly, he kissed her, brief but fierce, as if pouring 15 years of isolation and newfound hope into a single moment. Breaking away, he moved to the door, his expression shifting into something hard and unfamiliar. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Then, to her complete bewilderment, he opened the door and called out, "About time you got here! I was wondering how long it would take you fools to catch up." Ellie watched in stunned silence as Caleb stepped outside, hands raised in apparent surrender, addressing the armed men as if he'd been expecting them. "Holloway's paying good money for the widow," he continued loudly. "I've got her inside, been leading her along for days, making her think I was helping her. Figured delivering her straight to the boss would be worth more than just the bounty." Horror and confusion paralyzed Ellie as Caleb's words registered. A betrayal so complete, so sudden, that her mind couldn't process it. Yet his final words to her echoed in her ears. "Everything has been real, everything." The leader of Holloway's men dismounted cautiously. "And why should we believe you're not just trying to save your own hide?" "Because I know who you are." "Jenkins," Caleb replied confidently, "rode with your brother in Wyoming territory years back. And because I know Holloway wants the woman alive, Something about legal papers she's carrying. I'm just a bounty hunter who saw an opportunity. The reward still stands, right? The man named Jenkins studied Caleb suspiciously. Holloway didn't say nothing about another bounty hunter on her trail. Why would he? Caleb shrugged. More hunters, better chances of finding her. But I found her first, and I'm willing to share the reward if you help me deliver her to Pine Creek. Jenkins conferred briefly with his companions before turning back to Caleb. Show us the woman. Ellie's breath caught. This was the moment of truth. Either Caleb had genuinely betrayed her, a possibility that felt like a physical blow, or this was some desperate gambit she couldn't yet understand. Ellie, Caleb called, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. Come out now, it's over. With no choice but to play along, Ellie stepped through the door, keeping her face carefully blank despite the turmoil within. Caleb wouldn't meet her eyes. That's her all right, Jenkins confirmed, satisfaction evident in his tone. Victor will be pleased. So we have a deal, Caleb pressed. I ride with you to Pine Creek. We split the reward. Jenkins nodded slowly. Deal! But we keep the woman with us, and we'll be watching you, stranger. As Holloway's men bound her wrists, Ellie searched Caleb's face for any sign that this was part of some plan, any hint that his betrayal wasn't genuine. He gave nothing away, his expression cold and detached as she was roughly placed on one of the horses. The group set out immediately, unwilling to wait until morning. Ellie rode in the center of the formation, Jenkins leading her horse, Caleb riding nearby under the watchful eyes of the other bounty hunters. The territorial capital of Helena, so close they could have reached it in hours, receded behind them as they turned back toward Pine Creek and Victor Holloway's waiting justice. Hours passed in miserable silence, the cold night air biting through. Ellie's inadequate clothing. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had Caleb truly betrayed her, or was this an elaborate deception, a final, desperate attempt to get her close to Holloway, where they could expose his crimes? The deed he'd pressed into her hand, now hidden in her boot, suggested the latter, but his convincing performance left room for doubt. Near dawn, they stopped briefly to rest the horses. Jenkins maintained his vigilant guard, but Caleb managed to approach Ellie while ostensibly checking her bonds. Remember what I said, he murmured, so quietly she barely heard him. Trust me. Before she could respond, he moved away, resuming his role as the mercenary bounty hunter who'd betrayed her for gold. By midday, they'd reached a familiar region, the outer boundaries of Holloway's extensive ranch. Ellie recognized landmarks Thomas had pointed out during their rides together when he'd explained the property lines separating their modest homestead. From Victor's sprawling empire, we'll reach the main house by nightfall, Jenkins announced. Boss will want to handle this personally. Caleb rode closer to Jenkins, his voice casual yet persuasive. Might be smarter to question her before we deliver her. Find out what evidence she's carrying, where she's hidden it. Save Holloway the trouble. Jenkins considered this. What did you have in mind? There's an old line shack about 2 miles east, Caleb suggested. Private. We could get what Holloway needs. Look like heroes when we deliver both the woman and the information. Ellie held her breath, sensing this was part of whatever plan Caleb had formulated. Jenkins was clearly tempted by the prospect of additional favor from his employer. Half the men continue to the main house. Inform Holloway we've got her, Jenkins decided. The rest of us take her to the line shack, see what she knows. The group split as ordered, Jenkins leading a smaller contingent, including Caleb and Ellie, toward the isolated cabin. As they rode, Ellie noted Caleb subtly positioning himself closer to the man nearest him, a younger bounty hunter who rode, with his rifle across his saddle. The line shack appeared ahead, a crude, single-room structure used by cowboys tending the far reaches of Holloway's vast grazing lands. Currently unoccupied, it offered the privacy Jenkins sought for his interrogation. As they dismounted, Caleb made his move with stunning speed. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the young bounty hunter, using the man's own rifle to knock him unconscious. Before the others could react, he had the weapon aimed at Jenkins. "Don't!" he warned, as another man reached for his pistol. "I've got. No quarrel with you boys. This is between me and Holloway. Walk away now. You live to collect bounties another day." Jenkins's face contorted with rage and understanding. "You were playing us all along. I had to get close to Holloway somehow," Caleb confirmed, edging toward Ellie. "Now untie her nice and slow." Jenkins moved reluctantly toward Ellie, his eyes never leaving Caleb's steady rifle. With obvious resentment, he untied her bonds, stepping back immediately as she rubbed her chafed wrists. "Now your weapons," Caleb ordered. "Drop them and back away." The bounty hunters complied grudgingly, clearly calculating their chances and finding them wanting against Caleb's unwavering aim. Ellie quickly gathered their discarded guns, her movements efficient despite her exhaustion. "The horses too," Caleb added. "Send them running." Jenkins's face darkened with fury. "You're leaving us on foot in the middle of nowhere?" "Better than you deserve for hunting an innocent woman," Caleb replied coldly. "Start walking toward the main house. You'll reach it by tomorrow if you hurry." Once the disarmed men had disappeared over the ridge, Caleb finally lowered the rifle, turning to Ellie with concern etched across his weathered features. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. The tension that had sustained her through the ordeal suddenly collapsed. Before she could consider her actions, Ellie slapped him hard across the face, the crack of palm against skin startling them both. "Don't you ever do something like that." "Again," she said fiercely, voice shaking with emotion. "I thought you'd betrayed me." Caleb absorbed the blow without flinching, understanding in his eyes. "It was the only way to get close enough to Holloway. They'd have killed us both otherwise. You could have told me your plan." "Your reaction had to be genuine," he explained quietly. "Those men would have seen through any act." The logic of his explanation did nothing to ease the residual fear and hurt churning inside her. "I thought everything we'd been through meant nothing to you." Caleb stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I meant what I said before they arrived. Everything since I found you has been real, Ellie. Everything." The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. For a suspended moment, the wilderness around them seemed to fade away, leaving only this connection forged through danger and trust. A distant shout shattered the moment. Over the ridge, figures on horseback appeared. More of Holloway's men, alerted by the ones who'd continued to the main house. "We need to move," Caleb said urgently, helping Ellie onto one of the horses. "They'll have the whole territory searching for us now." They rode hard through the gathering dusk, taking advantage of Caleb's intimate knowledge of the land to evade. Immediate pursuit. Holloway's property stretched for miles in every direction, a vast empire built on intimidation and stolen claims. "Where are we going?" Ellie asked when they finally slowed, the horse's labored breathing concerning her. "Eleanor is in the opposite direction." "Can't go to Helena now," Caleb replied grimly. "They'll be watching every approach. We need another plan." Ellie's heart sank. So close to securing the evidence that would vindicate her claim, only to be driven further away by necessity. What about Sheriff Porter, if he's recovered enough to travel? Too risky to return to Walker's Creek. Besides, Porter's evidence is his word against Holloway's. We need something stronger. As full darkness descended, they took shelter in a shallow cave Caleb discovered beneath a rocky outcropping. The space barely accommodated them both, but it offered protection from the bitter night and concealment from searching eyes. Caleb built the smallest of fires, just enough to ward off the most dangerous cold. In its meager light, Ellie studied him, noting the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the grim determination that had replaced his usual stoic calm. "You have a plan," she observed quietly. I can see it in your face. He nodded slowly. Not one you're going to like. Tell me anyway. We go directly to Holloway's ranch, he said, confirming her suspicion. Not to the main house, but to the old records cabin where he keeps his business documents. If he fabricated loan papers against Thomas's property, the originals will be there. Ellie stared at him in disbelief. You want us to walk straight into Victor Holloway's stronghold after barely escaping his men today? It's where they'll least expect us, Caleb countered. They'll be searching the routes to Helena, watching for us to make a run for the territorial offices. Meanwhile, the evidence we need is sitting unguarded in Holloway's own filing cabinet. The audacity of the plan took her breath away. You're suggesting we steal the very documents he forged to steal my land? Not steal, Caleb corrected, a hint of grim humor touching his expression. Recover. Those papers are forgeries of your husband's signature. Having them in our possession proves. Holloway's fraud, Ellie considered the dangerous proposition. And you know where this records cabin is located. Worked as a hand on Holloway's ranch for 3 months before buying my own land, Caleb revealed, surprising her. Never met the man himself. He was back east during that time, but I know the property layout. This new information shifted her understanding of Caleb's history with Holloway. Not just a neighbor whose land had been coveted, but a former employee who knew the inner workings of the Holloway operation. The records cabin sits apart from the main house, he continued, sketching a rough map in the dirt. Used to be the original homestead before Holloway built his mansion. Only his most trusted men have access, but security is minimal. Who would dare steal from Victor Holloway on his own property? We would, Ellie said softly, the enormity of what they were contemplating settling over her. When? Tomorrow. Night. New moon. We'll approach from the north ridge where the guard patrols are thinnest. Sleep came fitfully that night, the cramped cave and looming danger making true rest impossible. Yet despite the circumstances, Ellie found herself drawing strength from Caleb's presence beside her. The mountain man who had emerged from 15 years of isolation to risk everything for justice had become her anchor in a world turned hostile. Dawn brought clear skies, but bitter cold. They ate sparingly from their dwindling supplies, conserving strength for the challenge ahead. Caleb spent the morning carefully checking and cleaning their weapons, while Ellie studied the crude map. He'd drawn, committing every detail to memory. Tell me about your life before, she said suddenly, needing conversation to distract from the anxiety gnawing at her. Before Sarah, before Montana Territory. Caleb's hands stilled briefly on the rifle barrel. He rarely spoke of his past. Each personal detail extracted like a splinter from deep tissue. Yet now, facing what might be their final day, something in him seemed to yield. Grew up in Ohio. Small farm. Father died when I was 12, left me and my mother to manage alone. His voice carried the flatness of old grief long accepted. Worked the riverboats on the Mississippi for a few years. Then the war came. You fought? Ellie asked gently. He nodded. Union infantry, 2 years, 3 months, 14 days. Saw when things no man should see. The simplicity of his statement conveyed more than lengthy descriptions ever could. Ellie had known many veterans in Philadelphia, broken men who carried the war's horrors in their haunted eyes. After the war, I drifted west. Couldn't settle, couldn't find peace in civilized places. Too many people, too much noise. Worked. Cattle drives in Texas, mining in Colorado, never staying anywhere long. His gaze grew distant, remembering. Then I met Sarah in a small settlement near Virginia City. She was teaching school there. The parallel to Ellie's own story. Another school teacher who had found love in the wilderness didn't escape her notice. She had this way of looking at the world, Caleb continued, his voice softening with memory. Finding beauty in places most people saw nothing but hardship. Made me want to see it through her eyes, build something permanent for once. Ellie reached out impulsively, covering his roughened hand with hers. She sounds remarkable. She was. His fingers interlaced with hers, accepting the comfort offered. Would have been a good mother too. The raw grief in those words struck Ellie deeply. For all the years that had passed, Caleb's loss remained an open wound, not just of his wife, but of the future they'd planned together, the children they'd never have. Thomas wanted children right away, Ellie found herself confessing. I was the one who wanted to wait, get the homestead properly established first. Regret colored her voice. If I'd agreed, there might be a part of him still here. Caleb's gaze met hers, understanding rather than judgment in his blue eyes. Or you might be facing Holloway with a child to protect as well. Some choices we don't get to see the other path for. They sat in companionable silence as the morning lengthened. Toward noon, hands still joined, each lost in thoughts of what might have been. When Caleb finally spoke again, his voice held newfound resolve. After tonight, whatever happens, things change. For both of us. Ellie nodded, feeling the truth of his words. Whether they succeeded or failed in their dangerous mission, nothing would return to what it had been before. Thomas was gone. The cabin they'd built together stood empty or destroyed, and Ellie herself had transformed from the sheltered schoolteacher into someone stronger, more determined. A woman who now understood that some principles were worth risking everything to defend. As dusk approached, they prepared for the night's infiltration. Caleb insisted they travel light, only essential weapons and equipment that wouldn't impede quick movement if they needed to flee. Ellie braided her hair tightly and darkened her face with ash from the fire, reducing the chance of being spotted in the darkness. Remember, Caleb instructed as they mounted their horses, if anything goes wrong, don't wait for me. Ride for Walker's Creek, find Dr. Evans. He'll help you reach Helena. Ellie met his gaze steadily. We go together, we leave together. I won't abandon you, Caleb. Though he clearly wanted to argue, something in her expression must have convinced him of her determination. With a reluctant nod, he turned his horse toward the distant Holloway ranch, now just a vague smudge on the darkening horizon. They approached, with extreme caution, leaving their horses concealed in a small grove nearly a mile from the ranch buildings. On foot, they navigated the periphery of Holloway's vast property, avoiding the main trails where guards might patrol. The Holloway ranch sprawled across the landscape like a small town. The main house, an ostentatious two-story structure with a wide veranda, was illuminated by lanterns, figures occasionally visible through windows. Bunkhouses for the ranch hands stood at a respectful distance, along with barns, corrals, and various outbuildings serving the operation's needs. There, Caleb whispered, pointing to a small cabin standing apart from the others, dark and apparently unoccupied. The records building. They watched for nearly an hour, observing patrol, patterns and movements around the compound. 2 armed men circled the main house regularly, but the records cabin received only occasional attention, a brief glance from passing guards, nothing more. Now, Caleb finally decided, when the guards had disappeared around the far side of the main house, they moved silently across the open ground, every sense heightened by danger. Reaching the cabin's shadow, they pressed against its rough wooden walls, listening intently for any sound from within. Hearing nothing, Caleb tried the door, locked as expected. "Stand back," he murmured, drawing a thin metal tool from his belt. With practiced movements that spoke of a past he'd never fully revealed to Ellie, he manipulated the simple lock until it yielded with a soft click. The interior was pitch black. Caleb struck a match, its flare momentarily blinding after the darkness. By its brief illumination, they located a lantern on a nearby desk. Once lit and adjusted to the dimmest possible flame, it revealed a meticulously organized office. Filing cabinets lined one wall, a large desk dominated the center of the room, and maps of the territory covered another wall, property boundaries clearly marked with pins and annotations. Ellie immediately recognized her own homestead on one map, already colored in the same shade as Holloway's holdings. "His arrogance is astounding," she whispered, anger flaring at this visual confirmation of Victor's presumption. "Focus," Caleb reminded her, already examining the filing cabinets. "We're looking for anything with Thomas's name, loan documents, property transfers." They worked methodically, conscious that each passing minute increased their risk of discovery. The filing system, at least, was logical, organized by property location rather than owner names. Caleb quickly located the section corresponding to the area where the Miller homestead stood. "Here," he said quietly, extracting a thick folder. "Everything relating to your land." Ellie joined him at the desk as he spread the documents in the lantern's dim light. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions and revealed depths to Victor Holloway's scheming that even they hadn't anticipated. The folder contained multiple forged documents. A loan agreement supposedly signed by Thomas 6 months before. His death, pledging the homestead as collateral. Transfer papers dated after Thomas's accident but bearing his apparent signature. And most damning of all, a letter to the Territorial Land Office requesting that the original deed be amended to remove Ellie's name, again with Thomas's forged signature. "He was erasing me completely," Ellie breathed, horror and fury mingling in her voice, making it as if I never had any claim at all. But what truly chilled her blood was a small note in Victor's handwriting attached to a receipt. "Jenkins, $50 for loosening Miller's saddle. Balance paid upon confirmation. Written proof of murder, casually documented among business expenses." "We need to take all of it," Caleb decided, gathering the documents. "This isn't just about your land anymore. It's evidence of premeditated murder." As he carefully folded the papers to conceal inside his coat, a floorboard creaked outside the cabin door. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances as the door handle turned slowly. Caleb extinguished the lantern with a swift movement, plunging the room into darkness. He pulled Ellie behind the desk, both drawing weapons as the door swung open. A figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, hesitating on the threshold. "Hello?" a woman's voice called softly. "Is someone there?" Ellie recognized the voice immediately, though she'd heard it only once before. "Gertrude Holloway," she whispered to Caleb. Against his warning gesture, Ellie stood slowly, keeping her pistol aimed steadily. "Mrs. Holloway," Gertrude gasped, one hand flying to her throat. "Eleanor Miller, they said you'd been caught. Reports of my capture were premature," Ellie replied coldly. "What are you doing here?" Instead of calling for help as expected, Gertrude Holloway stepped inside the cabin, closing the door behind her. In the darkness, her features were barely discernible, but her voice trembled with what sounded like nervous determination. "Looking for you, actually. Or rather hoping someone would come for these." She moved to a painting on the wall, removing it to reveal a small safe. With practiced movements, she worked the combination lock and extracted a packet of papers. The originals. Victor keeps copies in the files, but these are the actual documents with the forged signatures. Caleb had risen as well, confusion evident in his stance. "Why would you help us?" Gertrude's bitter laugh held no humor. "Because Victor killed my sister's husband the same way he killed Thomas Miller. Because he's threatened to do the same to me if I ever leave. Because in 20 years of marriage, I've watched him destroy dozens of families without consequence." She pressed the packet into Ellie's hands. "Sheriff Porter found me in town yesterday, told me what happened to him, what you were trying to do. I realized it might be my only chance." The pieces connected in Ellie's mind. "You want to escape him?" Gertrude nodded, desperation evident even in the darkness. These papers prove his crimes, all of them going back years. Property theft, fraud, even murder. I've been keeping copies of everything, waiting for an opportunity. Why not go to the authorities yourself? Caleb asked, suspicion clear in his tone. With what protection? Gertrude countered. Victor owns the local law, and I couldn't reach. Helena alone. He never lets me travel without supervision. Her voice broke slightly. If you can get these documents to the territorial authorities, Victor will be finished, and I'll finally be free. The sincerity in her plea was unmistakable, yet caution held Ellie back. Victor's wife could easily be setting a trap on her husband's orders. How did you know anyone would come here tonight? She questioned. I didn't, Gertrude admitted. I've been checking the records cabin every night since Porter spoke to me, hoping someone would come for evidence. She glanced nervously toward the window. But we don't have time for this now. Victor's entertaining business associates from Helena tonight. The extra security will be changing shifts in 10 minutes. That's your chance to slip away unnoticed. Despite lingering doubts, the urgency of their situation forced a decision. Ellie tucked Gertrude's packet inside her coat, alongside the documents they'd already collected. If this is a trap... Caleb left the threat unfinished. It's not, Gertrude assured them. But you need to go now. South path behind the stables is least guarded tonight. With reluctant nods, they edged toward the door, weapons still ready. Gertrude remained inside as they slipped out, presumably to avoid being seen with them. The compound remained relatively quiet as they made their way cautiously toward the indicated escape route. True to Gertrude's information, the area behind the stables was momentarily unguarded during what appeared to be a shift change. They had nearly reached the safety of darkness beyond the ranch buildings when a shout shattered the night's quiet. There, by the south fence. Instantly, lanterns flared to life across the compound. Running figures emerged from buildings, and the metallic sound of weapons being readied echoed through the night. "Run!" Caleb urged, pushing Ellie ahead of him as he turned to fire a covering shot toward their pursuers. They raced toward the tree line, bullets spitting dirt at their heels. Ellie's lungs burned with the effort, the precious documents weighing against her chest like a stone. Behind her, Caleb returned fire sparingly, each shot calculated to slow their pursuers rather than waste ammunition. They reached the trees, plunging into relative safety, but the pursuit showed no signs of relenting. Lanterns bobbed through the darkness behind them, accompanied by shouts and the crashing of men following their trail. "We need to split up," Caleb gasped as they paused briefly behind a fallen log. "I'll lead them west. You head straight for our horses." "No," Ellie objected immediately. "We stay together." A bullet splintered bark inches from her head, emphasizing the direness of their situation. "Ellie," Caleb said urgently, gripping her shoulders, "the documents are what matters. Get them to Helena. I'll find you." Before she could protest further, he kissed her fiercely, a gesture of passion and desperation that stole her breath. Then he was gone, crashing deliberately through the underbrush in the opposite direction, firing his pistol to draw attention. Heartbreaking at the choice forced upon her, Ellie clutched the documents tighter and ran toward where they'd left their horses. Behind her, most of the pursuit veered toward Caleb's more obvious trail, though a few lanterns continued in her direction. She reached the small grove breathless and terrified, relief washing through her at the sight of the horses still concealed where they'd left them. With shaking hands, she untied her mount, whispering soothing words to calm the animal's nervousness. At the distant gunfire, as she prepared to mount, a voice spoke from the darkness behind her. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Miller?" Victor Holloway stepped into the faint moonlight, rifle aimed steadily at her chest. His silver-streaked hair and fine clothing seemed incongruous in the wilderness setting, but his eyes held the same cold calculation she remembered from his visits to her cabin. "I haven't had the chance to properly thank you for trespassing," on my property, he continued conversationally, or for conspiring with my wife against me? Ellie's blood ran cold. Gertrude will be appropriately disciplined for her betrayal, Victor finished, his tone chilling in its casualness. As will you. You murdered my husband, Ellie said, voice steadier than she felt. Forged documents, stole land from countless families. Your crimes won't stay hidden forever, Victor, he smiled thinly. Yet here we are, you at the wrong end of my rifle, your mountain man being hunted down like the animal he is, and no one who matters any the wiser about my business methods. Udun, the distant gunfire had stopped, leaving an ominous silence. Ellie tried not to think about what that might mean for Caleb. Now, Victor continued, gesturing with his rifle, I believe you have some papers that belong to me. They're evidence of your crimes, Ellie countered, playing for time, desperately scanning the darkness for any chance of escape. Victor's patience visibly thinned. The documents, Mrs. Miller, now, or I'll simply take them from your corpse. The brutal directness of his threat left no doubt of his willingness to kill. Slowly, Ellie reached inside her coat, fingers closing around the packet of papers that represented her only hope of justice for Thomas, for Caleb's wife Sarah, for all of Victor's victims. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond Victor's shoulder. His head turned slightly at the sound. Attention momentarily divided. It was the only opening she'd get. With a sudden movement, Ellie flung the papers at Victor's face, simultaneously diving to the side as his rifle discharged, the bullet whistling past her ear. Before he could recover, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind him. Caleb, bloodied but alive, crashing into Victor with the full force of his body. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, the rifle spinning away into the underbrush. Ellie scrambled to retrieve the scattered papers while the men fought brutally on the forest floor. Victor's genteel appearance belied unexpected strength and viciousness. He landed a solid blow to Caleb's already bloodied side, drawing a grunt of pain. Looking desperately for a weapon, Ellie spotted Victor's fallen rifle. She seized it, turning back to find Victor now straddling Caleb, hands locked around his throat, squeezing with murderous intent. "Stop!" she commanded, aiming the rifle. "Let him go!" Victor didn't even glance her way, his focus entirely on choking the life from Caleb, whose struggles were weakening visibly. Without hesitation, Ellie fired. The shot shattered the night's silence. Victor jerked, a look of almost comical surprise crossing his features as he released Caleb's throat. Slowly, as if puzzled by this turn of events, he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his fine brocade vest. "You shot me," he said, sounding more offended than pained. "A woman shot me." Then he toppled sideways, crumpling onto the forest floor. Ellie rushed to Caleb, who was gasping for breath, angry bruises already forming on his throat. "Can you stand? We need to go. There'll be more coming." With effort, Caleb struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against her. "You saved my life," he rasped. "Returning the favor," she replied, helping him to his horse. "Now we need to save ourselves." They rode desperately through the night, pushing the horses to their limits, expecting pursuit at any moment. But the riders never materialized. Whether Holloway's men were scattered or searching in the wrong direction, fortune finally seemed to favor their escape. By dawn, they had put significant distance between themselves and the ranch. Caleb's condition worried Ellie. Aside from the bruising on his throat, he had a bullet graze along his ribs and various cuts and bruises from his fight with Victor. "We need to stop," she insisted when she noticed him swaying slightly in the saddle. "You're losing blood." Caleb shook his head stubbornly, though his face had taken on an alarming pallor. "Helena, almost there. You won't make it to Helena if you bleed to death first," Ellie countered, guiding their horses toward a sheltered ravine visible in the near distance. The small stream running through the ravine provided clean water to bathe Caleb's wounds while he rested against a sun-warmed rock. Ellie worked efficiently, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his injuries after cleaning them as best she could. "Is he dead?" Caleb asked finally, his voice still raspy from Victor's strangling hands. Ellie paused in her ministrations. "I don't know. I aimed for his shoulder, but he moved." She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. Despite everything Victor Holloway had done, the possibility that she had killed a man, even one so deserving of justice, weighed heavily on her conscience. "You did what you had to," Caleb reassured her, covering her blood-stained hand with his own. He wouldn't have shown either of us mercy. Looking into his eyes, eyes that had seen war, loss, and 15 years of isolation, Ellie found unexpected comfort. Caleb understood the burden of necessary violence in a way few others could. "The documents?" he asked, glancing around. "Safe," Ellie confirmed, patting her coat where she'd secured them after the confrontation. "All of them, even the ones that scattered when I threw them at Victor." Relief visibly passed through Caleb. "Then it wasn't for nothing. Whatever happens next, we have proof of what he did." "What happens next," Ellie said firmly, "is that we get these to the territorial authorities in Helena, and then you let a proper doctor tend those wounds." The ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "Yes, ma'am." They rested only as long as absolutely necessary before continuing their journey. Helena appeared on the horizon by mid-afternoon, its buildings a welcome sight after their ordeal. The territorial capital bustled with activity, miners, merchants, government officials, and settlers creating a vibrant tapestry of frontier life. After the isolation of recent weeks, the crowds felt overwhelming to Ellie, yet also offered welcome. Anonymity. Here, Holloway's influence might be diluted by distance and competing powers. Their first destination was the office of James Walsh, the banker Thomas had mentioned in his letter. They found him in a modest building near the territorial courthouse. A DO, serious, bespectacled man who recognized Thomas's name immediately. "Miller, yes," Walsh confirmed, studying Ellie with sympathy. "Terrible accident. I was grieved to hear of it." "It wasn't an accident," Ellie replied soberly. "And we have proof." Walsh's expression shifted from polite sympathy to alert interest as they laid out the documents before him. Thomas's letter, Gertrude's packet of evidence, and the papers they'd taken from Holloway's files, including the damning note about payment for tampering with Thomas's saddle. "This is extraordinary," Walsh said finally, adjusting his spectacles as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "And deeply disturbing. Victor Holloway has friends in high places, even here in Helena." "Does that mean you won't help us?" Caleb asked directly, his voice still raspy but stronger than before. Walsh straightened, indignation crossing his features. "It means precisely the opposite, Mr. Winters. Corruption thrives when good men do nothing. Thomas Miller was my friend, and if his death was murder disguised as accident, justice must be served." Relief flooded through Ellie. "Then you'll take this to the proper authorities?" "Better," Walsh replied, gathering the documents carefully. "I'll take you directly to Judge Hammond. He's one of the few territorial judges with both the integrity and the authority to act on evidence of this magnitude." As they followed Walsh through Helena's bustling streets toward the courthouse, Ellie felt a curious lightness despite her exhaustion. For weeks, survival and justice had been abstract goals, always just beyond reach, driving her forward through danger and hardship. Now, standing on the cusp of achieving both, she found herself thinking beyond justice to what might come after. She glanced at Caleb walking beside her, his injuries temporarily forgotten in the anticipation of finally exposing Holloway's crimes. In this man, once a stranger, now the person who knew her best in all the world, she had found something unexpected amid tragedy. Not merely an ally or protector, but a kindred spirit who understood loss and resilience. Whatever happened next, Ellie knew with sudden clarity that she didn't want to face it alone. Judge Hammond's chambers were imposing. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books lining the walls, an atmosphere of solemn authority. The judge himself matched his surroundings. A tall, silver-haired man with piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they presented with meticulous scrutiny. For nearly 2 hours, they detailed the evidence against Holloway. The forged documents, the pattern of land theft, the payment for Thomas's accident, and finally, the confrontation. At the ranch that had ended with Ellie shooting Victor. If he survived, Hammond noted gravely, he'll have his own version of events, one that paints you as trespassers who attacked him on his own property. The documents speak for themselves, Your Honor, Walsh pointed out. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, all clearly documented in Holloway's own records and handwriting. Hammond nodded slowly, his expression impossible to read. Enough to warrant a full investigation, certainly. He fixed Ellie with a penetrating gaze. You understand, Mrs. Miller, that even with this evidence, justice moves slowly. Holloway has resources, connections. This won't be resolved quickly or easily. I understand, Ellie replied steadily. But it will be resolved justly. Something like approval flickered in the judge's stern features. That, Mrs. Miller, I can promise you. I've been watching Victor Holloway's expansion for years, suspecting but never able to prove his methods. You've provided what many have failed, to secure hard evidence of his crimes. Hammond rose, signaling the end of their meeting. I'm issuing warrants immediately for Holloway if he lives, for his men who participated in these schemes, and for the recovery of all documentation from his property. Mr. Walsh, I'll need you to secure these materials in the court vault. As they prepared to leave, the judge addressed Ellie once more. Mrs. Miller, while the investigation proceeds, I suggest you remain in Helena, where we can ensure your safety. The same applies to you, Mr. Winters. Outside the courthouse, the reality of their situation settled upon them. They had set justice in motion, but resolution remained distant. And now they faced the practical concerns they'd been too focused to consider: where to stay, how to support themselves while waiting for the legal process to unfold. Walsh solved the immediate problem. I have a small guest house behind my residence, he offered. Used it when Thomas visited Helena on business. It's yours for as long as needed. The unexpected generosity brought tears to Ellie's eyes. Thank you, Mr. Walsh. We're grateful. Thomas was a good man, Walsh replied simply. Helping his widow is the least I can do to honor his memory. The guest house proved to be a comfortable 2-room cabin, modest but immaculately maintained. After weeks in the wilderness and Caleb's Spartan mountain shelter, it seemed luxurious beyond measure. A doctor summoned by Walsh tended Caleb's injuries, confirming what Ellie had already suspected. His wounds, while painful, weren't life-threatening. With proper rest and care, he would recover fully. That evening, after Walsh had departed and the doctor's ministrations were complete, Ellie and Caleb found themselves alone for the first time since their desperate flight from Holloway's ranch. The sudden privacy and safety, after so much danger and exposure, created an almost awkward atmosphere between them. Caleb stood by the small window, looking out at Helena's lights as dusk settled over the territorial capital. His profile in the fading light reminded Ellie of the first time she'd seen him, a silhouette against the wilderness, mysterious and apart from the world she knew. What will you do now? She asked quietly. After Holloway faces justice. He turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. Never planned that far ahead. Spent 15 years focused on one thing. Your land, Ellie suggested, remembering the deed he still carried. Caleb shook his head slowly. Not the land itself. Justice for Sarah. That's what kept me going all those years. His gaze met hers directly. Now I find myself thinking beyond that for the first time. The unspoken question hung between them, thinking beyond to what, to whom. Ellie moved closer, drawn by something neither of them had acknowledged directly, despite the kiss they'd shared in moments of desperation. "I've been thinking beyond too," she admitted softly. "The homestead was Thomas's dream that became mine, but dreams can change." "Ellie," Caleb began, then hesitated, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. "I'm not the man I was before all this. Before Sarah died, before 15 years alone changed me. I don't know if I remember how to live among people anymore." She reached for his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his years in the wilderness. "I'm not. The same woman who came west with Thomas 3 years ago. We've both been changed by loss and survival," her fingers intertwined with his. "Perhaps we understand each other because of that, not despite it." Caleb studied their joined hands, his expression a complex mixture of hope and lingering doubt. "You deserve certainty, Ellie, a future without shadows." "There are no guarantees in this life," she countered gently. "I learned that when Thomas died. All we can do is choose what matters most each day and protect it with everything we have." The tenderness in his eyes as he looked at her made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, Caleb raised his free hand to touch her cheek. "And what matters most to you now, Eleanor Miller?" Her answer didn't require words. Rising slightly on her toes, Ellie pressed her lips to his. Not the desperate farewell of their previous kiss, but a deliberate choice, a beginning rather than an ending. For a moment, Caleb remained still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this fragile new reality. Then his arms encircled her, drawing her closer with a gentleness that belied his strength. The kiss deepened, conveying what neither had fully articulated: how fundamentally they had transformed each other's lives, how impossible it now seemed to imagine a future apart. When they finally separated, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as if overwhelmed. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he whispered. "After Sarah, I believed that part of me was gone forever." Ellie placed her palm against his chest, feeling his heart's steady rhythm. "Not gone," she corrected softly, "just waiting." That night, for the first time since their ordeal began, they slept without fear. Caleb on the small sofa in the main room, Ellie in the bedroom, separate but connected by the unspoken promise that had formed between them. The future remained uncertain, justice still pending, but they had crossed a threshold together that neither wished to retreat from. Morning brought a commotion to Walsh's property. The arrival of Sheriff Porter, thinner and bearing the evidence of his ordeal in the bandaged absence of 2 fingers, but very much alive and determined. Dr. Evans accompanied him, the unlikely pair having traveled together from Walker's Creek once Porter was strong enough for the journey. "Judge Hammond's warrants are being executed as we speak," Porter reported, once they had exchanged greetings and shared abbreviated versions of their respective experiences. Deputies rode out at dawn for the Holloway Ranch. "And Victor?" Ellie asked, the question that had haunted her since that night in the forest. "Is he alive?" Porter nodded grimly. "Alive, but barely. Your shot wasn't fatal, but it was close. He's under guard at his ranch, too weak to be moved to Helena yet." Relief mingled with apprehension in Ellie's chest. She hadn't killed him, wouldn't carry that burden, but his survival meant they would eventually face him again, this time in court. "What about Gertrude?" she asked, remembering the desperate woman who had helped them at great personal risk. Porter and Evans exchanged a troubled glance. "Found beaten unconscious in the records cabin," Porter admitted reluctantly. "Victor must have discovered her involvement immediately. Evans here treated her before we left. She regained consciousness, Before our departure, the doctor added. Her first words were to ask if you'd escaped with the documents. When I confirmed you had, she seemed at peace despite her injuries. Ellie's heart ached for the woman trapped in a violent marriage for 20 years, who had risked everything to help strangers obtain justice her husband had long denied others. Will she recover? Physically, yes, Evans replied. The rest depends on what happens to Victor. The following weeks unfolded with agonizing slowness. Judge Hammond's investigation proceeded methodically, deputies bringing in Holloway's men one by one for questioning. Some remained defiantly loyal to their employer, but others, sensing which way the wind was blowing, offered testimony in exchange for leniency. Gradually, the full extent of Victor Holloway's criminal enterprise emerged. Not just the theft of the Miller homestead and Caleb's land years earlier, but dozens of similar schemes throughout the territory. Forged documents, intimidation, sabotage, and when necessary, violence disguised as accident, all meticulously orchestrated to build his empire while maintaining a veneer of respectability. Ellie and Caleb remained in Helena, their presence required as primary witnesses in the pending case. The forced inactivity was particularly difficult for Caleb, who had spent 15 years in constant movement through the wilderness. Though he never complained, Ellie noticed how he would stand at windows, gazing toward the distant mountains with unconscious longing. To occupy themselves, they began exploring options for their future after the trial. The Miller homestead, Ellie learned, had indeed been burned after their escape, Holloway's final vengeful act before her bullet felled him. Yet with the fraud exposed, her legal claim to the land remained intact. We could rebuild, she suggested one evening as they walked through Helena's busy streets. The spring is still there, the timber, start fresh. Caleb considered this thoughtfully. Is that what you want? To return to where Thomas died? The question gave her pause. She'd been thinking practically. The land was valuable, legally hers, a tangible asset. But Caleb's question went deeper, to the emotional reality of rebuilding on ground soaked with painful memories. I don't know, she admitted honestly. Part of me feels obligated to honor Thomas's dream, to finish what we started together. But another part wants something that's ours, not an extension of what came before, Caleb finished for her, understanding in his eyes. She nodded, grateful for his perception. Is that wrong of me, to want to begin completely anew? No, he said simply, taking her hand as they continued walking. The land will always be there, your legal right to it secured. But where we build our life, that should be a choice we make together, free from shadows. The casual way he referred to our life sent warmth through Ellie's heart. Despite the uncertainty still surrounding them, this much had become clear. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. As their month in Helena extended into 2, Ellie found herself drawn to the territorial schoolhouse at the edge of town. Initially visiting out of curiosity and memories of her teaching days in Philadelphia, she soon began volunteering several hours each week, helping the overwhelmed schoolmistress with lessons. The familiar routine of education, organizing lessons, encouraging reluctant students, celebrating small victories of understanding, reconnected her to a part of herself that had been dormant since leaving the East. She returned from these sessions animated and fulfilled in a way Caleb clearly noticed. You miss teaching, he observed after one particularly enthusiastic recounting of a young girl's sudden comprehension of fractions. Ellie smiled, slightly embarrassed at her own excitement. I do. I'd almost forgotten how rewarding it is to open young minds to new ideas. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a decision crystallizing. There's a settlement forming near Thunder Valley, he said carefully. New families arriving every month. They'll need a school soon, a teacher. She studied him, detecting something specific behind his casual observation. "You've been making inquiries?" He nodded, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Just exploring possibilities. The settlement's on good land, near water, far enough from Pine Creek to avoid daily reminders, close enough to your homestead to maintain it if you wished." "And what would you do there?" Ellie asked, touched by his thoughtfulness, but concerned about his needs as well. "A growing settlement might feel confining after your years of freedom." "They need someone who knows the territory, can guide hunting parties, teach frontier skills," Caleb replied. "The settlement leader mentioned they'd pay for such services." A small smile touched his lips. "And the mountains would still be there when I needed solitude." The image formed in Ellie's mind, a simple life in a growing community, each of them contributing their unique skills, building something new together while maintaining connections to what mattered from their pasts. Not a replacement for what either had lost, but something different, shaped by who they had become through adversity. "It sounds perfect," she said softly, her hand finding his. "When this is over." The unfinished thought hung between them, a promise, a future glimpsed but not yet reached. Their period of waiting ended abruptly in early spring, when Victor Holloway was finally deemed well enough to travel to Helena for formal charges and trial. The news reached them through James Walsh, who had become not merely an ally but a friend during their extended stay. "He arrived under heavy guard this morning," Walsh informed them, his expression grave. "The trial is set to begin next week. Judge Hammond wants you both prepared to testify." Reality crashed back upon them. The confrontation they had been simultaneously dreading and waiting for was finally at hand. Victor would face them across a courtroom, those cold, calculating eyes fixed on them as they recounted his crimes. "What about Gertrude?" Ellie asked. "Will she testify as well?" Walsh nodded. "She arrived separately yesterday, staying with Judge Hammond's family for protection. Her testimony may prove most damaging of all, 20 years as witness to Victor's methods." As the trial date approached, Helena buzzed with anticipation. Victor Holloway's influence and wealth had made him a territorial power. His disgrace, the most significant legal proceeding in Montana's recent history. The courthouse would be packed, the town filled with spectators and journalists from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The night before their scheduled testimony, Ellie found Caleb outside Walsh's guest house, staring at the star-filled sky with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Nervous about tomorrow?" she asked, joining him in the small garden. "Not about testifying," he replied, his voice distant. "About seeing him again. 15 years I've carried the image of the man who took everything from me. Now I'll face him in the flesh." Ellie understood. For her, Victor Holloway represented months of fear and danger, the loss of her home, the discovery of Thomas's murder. For Caleb, he embodied 15 years of solitary grief, a ghost that had shaped his entire existence. "What are you afraid might happen?" she asked gently. Caleb's jaw tightened. "That seeing him will bring it all back, the rage, the helplessness. That I'll look at him and become the man I was after Sarah died, consumed by vengeance, empty of everything else." She moved closer, slipping her arm through his. "You aren't that man anymore, Caleb. If you were, you wouldn't fear becoming him. Again." His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "Tomorrow changes everything. One way or another, the chapter that's defined most of my life closes. And a new one begins," Ellie added softly. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, we face it together, and whatever comes after." The territorial courthouse hummed with tension the following morning, every seat filled, spectators lining the walls. Victor Holloway sat at the defense table, noticeably thinner and paler than when Ellie had last seen him in the forest, but his eyes remained cold and calculating as ever. He wore an expensive suit that couldn't quite disguise the weakened state of his body, a lingering testament to Ellie's bullet. Gertrude sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, eyes downcast, a subtle tremor visible in her clasped hands. The physical evidence of her beating had faded, but the nervous fragility of her posture spoke volumes about the invisible scars she carried. Judge Hammond entered, his commanding presence immediately silencing the murmuring crowd. With minimal preamble, the proceedings began, a formal reading of charges so extensive it took nearly 20 minutes to complete. Murder, attempted murder, fraud, forgery, intimidation, theft. The list of Victor Holloway's crimes represented a lifetime of unchecked greed and brutality. To each charge, Victor offered the same response. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice, though weaker than in his prime, carried the same arrogant certainty Ellie remembered from their confrontations at her cabin. He truly believed himself beyond the reach of justice, even now. The territorial prosecutor began methodically presenting evidence, the documents they had recovered from Holloway's records cabin first among them. As material proof was introduced, witnesses were called to authenticate and expand upon the documentary evidence. Sheriff Porter testified early, explaining how he had turned a blind eye to Holloway's activities for years out of fear, only finding his courage when the scheme to murder Ellie became clear. His testimony, delivered with evident shame, for his prior cowardice, painted a picture of a county systematically corrupted by one man's influence. When Ellie's turn came, she ascended to the witness stand with outward calm that belied her churning emotions. Victor's gaze followed her every movement, his expression unreadable, but somehow threatening despite his diminished condition. Under the prosecutor's careful questioning, Ellie recounted everything: Thomas's death, the subsequent harassment, her flight into the wilderness, the discovery of Victor's complicity in her husband's accident, and finally, the confrontation that ended with her shooting him. "And why did you fire upon Mr. Holloway, Mrs. Miller?" the prosecutor asked. "He was killing Mr. Winters," Ellie replied steadily, her gaze meeting Victor's without flinching. "Strangling him. I ordered him to stop. When he didn't, I had no choice." Victor's defense attorney, an expensive import from Helena's most prestigious firm, rose for cross-examination, his manner aggressively confident. "Mrs. Miller, isn't it true that you and your companion, Mr. Winters, were trespassing on Holloway property that night?" he began, emphasizing companion with insinuating distaste. "We were retrieving evidence of Mr. Holloway's crimes," Ellie corrected. "Evidence you obtained by breaking and entering," the attorney pressed. "By your own admission, you shot Mr. Holloway on his own property while engaged in criminal activity yourselves." Before Ellie could respond, Judge Hammond intervened. "The witness has already established that she fired to prevent Mr. Holloway from committing murder. Move on, counselor." The attorney shifted tactics smoothly. "Mrs. Miller, your homestead claim was jointly held with your late husband, correct?" "Yes," Ellie confirmed, unsure where this line of questioning led. "And you had been married how long before coming west?" 2 weeks. A thin smile spread across the attorney's face. "Just 2 weeks. A very hasty marriage. And Thomas Miller was a man of some property and prospect, was he not, while you were merely a school teacher of limited means?" The implication hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Ellie's cheeks flushed with indignation. "I loved my husband, sir. Our marriage was brief but genuine. So genuine that immediately after his tragic death, you formed an attachment to another man." The attorney gestured toward Caleb, seated in the front row. "One might almost suspect a pattern of seeking male protection and financial security." Outrage rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hammond's gavel cracked sharply. "That's enough, counselor. One more insinuation of that nature, and you'll be held in contempt." The attorney bowed slightly, his objective already accomplished, planting seeds of doubt about Ellie's character and motivations. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she felt Victor's cold smile following her. Satisfied with his lawyer's attempt to smear her reputation, rather than address the evidence against him, Caleb's testimony followed, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the attorney's theatrical tactics. He recounted his own history with Holloway, the theft of his land, Sarah's death in the suspicious fire, his years of isolation. When asked why he had helped Ellie rather than pursuing his own vendetta against Holloway, his answer silenced the courtroom. Because helping her was justice, vengeance would have only continued the cycle. The defense attorney attempted the same character assassination with Caleb, portraying him as a deranged mountain man with a 15-year obsession, a man who had manipulated a vulnerable widow into helping him attack a respected businessman. But Caleb's straightforward responses, devoid of the emotional reactions the attorney tried to provoke, gradually frustrated the strategy. By the time Gertrude Holloway took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had grown heavy with accumulated evidence and testimony. As Victor's wife began recounting 2 decades of witnessing his criminal activities, documenting his methods and victims, Victor's composed facade finally cracked. "Lying bitch!" he shouted suddenly, rising from his chair despite his weakened condition. "After everything I gave you," Judge Hammond's gavel slammed repeatedly, "remove the defendant if he cannot control himself." Guards moved to restrain Victor, who continued hurling invective at his wife until they physically forced him back into his seat, his face contorted with rage. The outburst accomplished what hours of testimony might not have, revealing the violent truth beneath the veneer of civilization he had maintained in court. Gertrude never flinched, never raised her voice in response to her husband's abuse. She simply continued her testimony, years of practicing composure in the face of threat serving her well in this public arena. The trial extended over 2 weeks, witness after witness adding detail to the comprehensive picture of Victor Holloway's criminal empire. Former employees testified to carrying out his orders. Neighboring landowners described the pattern of intimidation they had witnessed or experienced. Territorial Land Office clerks confirmed the suspicious pattern of property transfers that had expanded Holloway holdings over the years. Through it all, Victor maintained his innocence, his defense built primarily on attacking the credibility of witnesses rather than refuting the documentary evidence. His attorney portrayed him as a successful businessman targeted by jealous competitors and disgruntled former associates, a victim of conspiracy rather than a perpetrator of crimes. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, Helena held its collective breath. Would Holloway's money and lingering influence prevail despite the mountain of evidence? Or would justice finally reach a man who had evaded it for decades? Ellie and Caleb waited with James Walsh in his office, too restless to remain in the guest house, but unwilling to face the curious crowds gathered around the courthouse. The hours stretched interminably, each passing without word from the jury, increasing their apprehension. "It shouldn't be taking this long," Ellie fretted as evening approached with still no verdict. The evidence was overwhelming. "These are serious charges," Walsh reminded her. "Murder, most significantly. The jury will be thorough, knowing a man's life hangs in the balance." Caleb, who had been standing silently by the window, turned toward them. "It's not just Victor's life at stake. It's everyone he's harmed, everyone who's waiting to see if the law protects the powerful or serves justice equally." His words crystallized what had been bothering Ellie throughout the trial. This proceeding represented more than personal vindication or justice for Thomas and Sarah. It was a test of whether the frontier territories were governed by law or merely by whoever wielded the most money and influence. The answer came at dusk, when a court messenger arrived with summons for their return to the courthouse. The jury had reached its verdict. they found the courtroom even more packed than during testimony, news of the impending verdict having drawn everyone within miles to witness the outcome. Victor sat impassively at the defense table, his earlier outburst apparently forgotten as he maintained the composed demeanor of a man merely inconvenienced by proceedings beneath his dignity. Judge Hammond entered, his expression revealing nothing, as he instructed the jury foreman to read the verdict. A hush fell over the assembly as the foreman rose, unfolding the paper that contained Victor Holloway's fate. On the charge of murder in the death of Thomas Miller, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ellie's hand found Caleb's, gripping it tightly as the foreman continued through the list of charges. Guilty on forgery, fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. On charge after charge, the verdict remained the same, the weight of Victor Holloway's crimes finally catching up to him after decades of impunity. Only when the foreman finished did Ellie dare look at Victor. The composed mask had shattered, disbelief and fury warring in his features as he stared at the jury as if unable to comprehend that they had dared to convict him. Judge Hammond's sentencing was immediate and unequivocal. Victor Holloway, you have been found guilty of the most serious crimes this court has ever adjudicated. Your actions reveal a pattern of lawlessness and cruelty spanning decades, hidden beneath a veneer of respectability that can no longer shield you from justice. The judge paused, surveying the packed courtroom before delivering his judgment. For the murder of Thomas Miller, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. For the additional crimes of which you have been convicted, I sentence you to life imprisonment. Should you somehow escape the first sentence, you will serve the second. Uproar erupted in the courtroom, shock, vindication, protest, all mingling. In a cacophony that Hammond's gavel could barely control, Victor himself seemed frozen, as if the reality of his downfall had not yet penetrated his consciousness. As guards moved to remove him, Victor's gaze locked with Ellie's across the churning crowd. For an instant, she glimpsed something beyond. The cold calculation that had always defined him, perhaps the first genuine emotion she'd ever seen in those eyes. Fear. Then he was gone, escorted from the courtroom to await execution. Outside on the courthouse steps, well-wishers and curious onlookers surrounded them, everyone eager to congratulate the woman and mountain man who had brought down the territory's most untouchable criminal. Sheriff Porter pushed through the crowd to reach them, his expression reflecting the same stunned relief they felt. "It's really over," he said, shaking his head in wonderment. "Never thought I'd see the day Victor Holloway faced true justice." "What happens now?" Ellie asked, still processing the finality of the verdict and sentence. Porter shrugged. "For Holloway, appeal most likely, though Hammond's reputation for fairness makes overturning the verdict unlikely. For the rest of us," he glanced around at the dispersing crowd, "life goes on. Land claims will be sorted out, properties returned to rightful owners where possible." "And Gertrude?" Caleb asked, his thoughts turning to the woman whose courage had proven decisive in her husband's conviction. "Free to build whatever life she chooses," Porter replied. "Though what that might look like after 20 years with Victor is anyone's guess." As the crowd thinned, Ellie found herself gazing out over Helena toward the distant mountains beyond. Somewhere out there lay the Miller homestead, her land by law, though now empty of the home she and Thomas had built together. Somewhere too was Caleb's original property, the place where he had planned a future with Sarah before tragedy struck. Their past losses would always remain part of them, but the ghosts that had driven them both no longer seemed to possess the same power. Justice, while imperfect and delayed, had been served. Victor Holloway would harm no one else. "What now?" Caleb asked quietly, echoing her own thoughts as he came to stand beside her. "The Thunder Valley settlement?" Ellie considered the possibilities stretching before them, a fresh start in a growing community, her teaching skills needed, his knowledge of the land valued, a place where they could build something together that honored what came before without being defined by it. "Yes," she said with growing certainty, "though there's something I'd like to do first." The following day, they rode out to what remained of the Miller homestead. The journey felt different from their desperate flight months earlier, not a retreat from danger, but a deliberate visitation, a pilgrimage of sorts. The cabin Thomas had built with such care was indeed gone, reduced to a charred foundation by Holloway's vindictive order. Yet the land itself remained, the fertile soil, the valuable spring, the stands of timber that had first attracted Thomas's discerning eye. Ellie dismounted slowly, taking in the scene with emotions too complex to name. This place represented both her greatest love and deepest loss, the beginning of her western journey and the crucible that had transformed her from sheltered schoolteacher to survivor. "I'd like to visit your land too," she said to Caleb, who stood respectfully at a distance, allowing her this moment of reckoning. "Before we start anew, I want to honor what came before, for both of us." He nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "It's a day's ride east, nothing left of the cabin, but the land is much as it was." They spent an hour at the homestead, Ellie gathering a few wildflowers to place where the cabin's threshold had been. A small gesture of remembrance for the life she and Thomas had shared there. Not goodbye exactly, but acknowledgement that while this place would always be part of her story, it was no longer her home. The ride to Caleb's former property was undertaken in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts, yet connected by shared understanding. They made camp under stars, just visible through gathering clouds, the promise of spring rain heavy in the air. "What will you do with your land?" Ellie asked as they sat beside the small fire. "Will you reclaim it now that Holloway's grip is broken?" Caleb gazed into the flames, considering. "I've thought about that since the verdict. The land itself holds no joy for me anymore. Too many painful memories. But selling it feels wrong too, like erasing Sarah completely." "Perhaps there's a third option," Ellie suggested. "Something that honors Sarah's memory while allowing you to move forward." His questioning glance invited her to continue. "You mentioned once that Sarah was a teacher, like me. What if the land became a school? The settlement might grow in that direction eventually. A place of learning named for her could be a fitting tribute." The idea visibly moved him, emotions playing across his usually stoic features. "She would have liked that," he said softly, "helping new generations find their way." Morning brought them to Caleb's former homestead. 300 acres of rolling meadows bordered by stands of pine, a stream cutting through its heart. Like the Miller property, nothing remained of the original structures, time and weather having erased even the charred remnants of the cabin Caleb had built for Sarah. Yet Ellie could see why he had chosen this place 15 years earlier. It held a natural beauty, a sense of possibility that transcended the tragedy that had occurred here. In another life, children might have played along that stream, a family grown old together, watching seasons change across these meadows. "I never came back after the fire," Caleb admitted, standing at what had once been the cabin site. "Couldn't bear to see it empty of everything I'd hoped for." Ellie moved to his side, taking his hand. "And now? Now I see that some dreams end, so others can begin," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Sarah would have wanted me to find happiness again, not spend 15 years alone with ghosts and vengeance." They remained at the homestead until midday, Caleb walking the boundaries of his property with new purpose, mentally placing the school that might someday stand there. When they finally turned their horses toward Thunder Valley and the future awaiting them, both felt an invisible weight lifting, not the absence of grief, which would always remain part of them, but its transformation into something that could coexist with newfound joy. The journey to Thunder Valley took them through changing landscapes, winter's grip loosening as lower elevations welcomed early spring. Meadows showed the first blush of green, creeks ran high with melting snow, and birdsong filled forests awakening from dormancy. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, Ellie drew her horse to a halt, taking in the view with fresh eyes. Below, the settlement spread along the valley floor. Perhaps 30 structures now, with cleared fields. Surrounding them, smoke rose from chimneys. Children played in the central common, and the frame of a new building rose at the settlement's edge. "The school," Caleb explained, noting her gaze. "They've already begun construction, hoping to attract a qualified teacher before summer's end." Ellie smiled, imagining the possibilities. Perfect timing, then. They rode down into the valley side by side, strangers arriving at a new beginning. Yet unlike their previous journeys, Ellie following Thomas West with naive optimism, Caleb retreating into wilderness solitude after devastating loss. This arrival carried the weight of experience and the strength of considered choice. Whatever challenges awaited in this growing frontier community, they would face them together. The schoolteacher who had discovered her own courage, and the mountain man who had found his way back to humanity through unexpected love. Their shared past of loss and survival had forged a foundation stronger than either could have built alone. The settlement came alive around them as they approached, curious faces appearing in doorways, children pausing in their play to stare. At the newcomers, a few men setting aside tools to greet potential additions to their community. The settlement's leader, a barrel-chested man named Marcus Freeman, stepped forward to greet them, his weathered face creasing with recognition as Caleb introduced himself. "Winters, we'd begun to think you weren't coming," Freeman said, extending a calloused hand. "Word reached us about the Holloway trial, quite a story making its rounds through the territory." "This is Eleanor Miller," Caleb replied, gesturing to Ellie, "the teacher I mentioned in my letter." Freeman's face brightened visibly. "Mrs. Miller, your arrival couldn't be better timed. The school's nearly finished and we've 15 children waiting for proper education." He gestured proudly toward the rising framework at the settlement's edge. "Not as grand as Eastern establishments, I'm sure, but solid construction." "It looks perfect," Ellie assured him, already envisioning the space filled with eager young minds. "I'd love to see it up close." As Freeman led them through the settlement, introducing them to residents along the way, Ellie observed the sense of purpose and cooperation evident in this fledgling community. Unlike Pine Creek, with its established hierarchies and Holloway's dominating influence, Thunder Valley operated on more egalitarian principles, each family contributing according to their skills, decisions made collectively rather than imposed from above. "We've set aside the cabin at the eastern edge for you," Freeman explained, pointing toward a modest structure nestled beneath tall pines. "Nothing fancy, but weather-tight and close to the school site. We can build something larger once you're settled, if needed." The unspoken assumption in his words that Ellie and Caleb would share the dwelling brought warmth to her cheeks. Though their growing relationship was no secret to themselves, they hadn't discussed such practical arrangements explicitly. Sensing her momentary discomfort, Caleb intervened smoothly. "I'll need separate quarters, at least initially. My guide work will keep me in the mountains for days at a time." Freeman nodded, though his expression suggested he found the arrangement curious. The hunting cabin behind the main structure should serve then. Small, but suitable for a man accustomed to wilderness living. They spent the remainder of the day touring the settlement, meeting families eager to welcome a teacher for their children, and a guide who knew the surrounding territory intimately. By evening, Ellie felt a growing certainty they had made the right choice. This community, still forming its identity and traditions, offered space to contribute meaningfully while building a new life unburdened by painful associations. Their first weeks in Thunder Valley established routines that acknowledged both their individual roles and deepening connection. Ellie threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse, organizing donated books, developing lesson plans appropriate for the varied ages and educational backgrounds of her prospective students. Caleb alternated between guiding hunting parties from the settlement and teaching wilderness skills to older boys eager to learn from the legendary mountain man whose name had spread through territorial stories. Evenings often found them sharing a simple meal in Ellie's cabin, discussing the day's events and planning for the community's needs. These quiet moments, more than anything, solidified the partnership that had begun in crisis and now flourished in peacetime. 1 month after their arrival, with the schoolhouse completed and classes scheduled to begin the following week, Caleb returned from a 3-day hunting expedition with unusual energy, finding Ellie arranging her modest classroom. "I have something to show you," he said, barely containing his excitement. "Can you ride out with me tomorrow morning?" Curious about what could elicit such enthusiasm from his typically reserved nature, Ellie readily agreed. They set out at dawn, riding east into territory she hadn't yet explored. After several hours, they crested a ridge overlooking a hidden valley, smaller than Thunder Valley, but equally beautiful, with a clear stream winding through meadows framed by protective mountains. "It's lovely," Ellie commented, unsure why this particular spot warranted a special journey. Caleb guided his horse forward, descending into the valley with Ellie following. At the center of the largest meadow, he dismounted and helped her down from her horse. "This land isn't claimed," he explained, his blue eyes bright with possibility. "I checked the territorial records while in Helena. It's similar to what Thomas chose for your homestead. Good water, timber, grazing opportunities. But it's also..." He hesitated, searching for words. "It's untouched by our pasts. No memories, good or painful, just possibility." Understanding dawned as Ellie surveyed the pristine landscape. "You want to claim it? Build here." He nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "I thought perhaps we might claim it together. Build something that belongs to both of us, not shaped by what came before." The implication wasn't lost on Ellie. This wasn't merely about property, it was about the future they had begun envisioning together since the trial's conclusion. "I would need to maintain quarters near the school during the week," she said practically, though her heart raced at the proposal's deeper meaning. "Teaching responsibilities." "Of course," Caleb agreed quickly. "We would keep your cabin in the settlement. This would be for our future, built at our own pace." His typically confident voice held a note of vulnerability she rarely heard. "If you want that future together..." Ellie moved closer, reaching for his hand. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Caleb Winters?" The hint of a smile touched his lips. Not very skillfully, it seems. "Ask me properly," she encouraged gently. "After everything we've faced together, we deserve the words spoken plainly." Taking both her hands in his, Caleb's expression grew serious. "Eleanor Miller, I never expected to find love again after Sarah died. Never thought I'd want to build a home, plant roots, plan for years ahead. You changed everything." His voice deepened with emotion. "Would you marry me? Build this new life together, teaching, guiding, creating something that honors what we've lost but isn't defined by it." Tears blurred Ellie's vision as she nodded, unable to speak immediately past the tightness in her throat. When words finally came, they were simple but encompassed everything she felt. Yes, all of it. Yes. Their marriage took place 1 month. Later, in Thunder Valley's newly completed schoolhouse, a fitting location for the teacher's wedding and symbolic of the education both had received through hardship and resilience. The entire settlement gathered to witness the union, along with special guests who had traveled considerable distances to attend. Sheriff Porter arrived from Pine Creek, his position now restored with integrity after Holloway's downfall. Dr. Evans accompanied him, having decided to relocate his practice to Thunder Valley now that the settlement was growing rapidly. Even Gertrude Holloway made the journey, her quiet dignity and evident relief at her husband's imprisonment earning her unexpected acceptance from those who understood the courage her testimony had required. James Walsh represented Helena's contingent, bringing news that Caleb's proposal for converting his original property into a school named for Sarah had been approved by territorial authorities. Construction would begin the following spring, funded partially by assets seized from Victor Holloway's criminal enterprise. The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt, Ellie and Caleb exchanging vows they had written themselves, promises not of blind devotion but of conscious partnership, each acknowledging the shadows of their pasts while committing to the light of their shared future. "I take you not to replace what I've lost," Caleb vowed, his voice steady and clear in the crowded schoolhouse, "but to create something new that couldn't exist without the journey that brought us together." Ellie's response matched his honesty. "I promise to walk beside you, neither leading nor following, as we build this life neither of us imagined, but both now choose with open eyes and full hearts." As summer yielded to autumn, their shared vision took tangible form. Weekdays found Ellie teaching in the settlement school, her natural gift for education, enriched by the personal strength she'd discovered through adversity. Weekends often saw them working on their homestead in the Hidden Valley, the cabin they built together, rising gradually from the fertile ground. Caleb's guiding work expanded as news of the settlement's skilled mountain man spread through the territory. His knowledge of wilderness survival, once employed purely for personal isolation, now served to protect others and ensure the community's prosperity. The man who had spent 15 years avoiding human connection became, ironically, an essential link between civilization and the untamed lands surrounding it. Their first Christmas in Thunder Valley brought unexpected news that shifted their future once again. Dr. Evans confirmed what Ellie had begun to suspect: a child would join their family by summer's end. The prospect of parenthood, once painfully abandoned after Thomas's death, now returned as a gift neither had dared anticipate. "Are you afraid?" Caleb asked one evening as they sat before the fire in their nearly completed valley cabin, his hand resting gently on her still flat abdomen. Ellie considered the question honestly. "Not of motherhood itself," she answered, "but of loving so completely again, knowing how quickly it can be taken away. Yes, that frightens me." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sarah was carrying our child when she died. I never even had the chance to know them." His voice held old sorrow, but not the raw grief that had once defined him. "For years after, I thought loving again would dishonor their memory. Now I understand it honors them most fully. By living as they would have wanted us to," Ellie completed his thought, "with courage rather than fear." As spring painted the valley with wildflowers, they made their final move to the homestead, though Ellie maintained her cabin near the schoolhouse for days when weather or her advancing pregnancy made the journey impractical. The home they had built together held elements of both their pasts: Thomas's books sharing shelves with Sarah's preserved needlework, rescued from Caleb's mountain cabin, yet the overall feeling was undeniably fresh, a new beginning rather than a continuation. Word arrived periodically of developments beyond their peaceful valley. Victor Holloway's execution had proceeded despite expensive appeals, final justice for Thomas, Sarah, and countless others who had suffered from his ruthless ambition. Gertrude had sold the sprawling ranch, distributing much of the proceeds among families who had lost land to her husband's schemes. keeping only enough to establish a modest boarding house in Helena, where she found unexpected fulfillment in creating a safe haven for travelers. Their daughter arrived in late summer, strong-lunged and determined from her first breath, with Caleb's striking blue eyes and what would later prove to be Ellie's quick intelligence. They named her Hope Sarah Miller Winters, honoring both their pasts while celebrating the future she represented. Standing together on the porch of their valley home, their infant daughter cradled in Ellie's arms, they watched the sunset paint the surrounding mountains in crimson and gold. The journey that had brought them to this moment, from desperate widow and solitary mountain man to partners in life's fullest sense, seemed both improbable and inevitable in retrospect. "Did you ever imagine this?" Ellie asked softly, leaning against Caleb's solid presence. "During those years alone in the wilderness?" He shook his head, wonder evident in his expression as he gazed at his wife and daughter. "I imagined justice, occasionally vengeance, never this kind of peace." She understood completely. The frontier that had claimed so much from them both had ultimately offered an unexpected gift: the chance to rebuild from tragedy, to discover strength neither knew they possessed, and to find in each other the courage to love again, despite knowing its terrible risks. As darkness settled over their valley, lights from the cabin windows cast a gentle glow across the homestead they had created together, not a replacement for what had been lost, but something entirely new. A sanctuary built by 4 hands that had known both tenderness and terrible necessity, a home founded on the truth that the human heart, like the frontier itself, contained both tremendous danger and unlimited possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.